So, assuming we are live, welcome everyone to the 27th meeting of the Committee for Finance in the 2022 to 2027 mandate. Members, this meeting is broadcast online and throughout Parliament buildings. If you have a phone, put it on airplane or silent mode. Apologies. We have no apologies. We're sorry, we do have one apology from Dr. Steve Aiken. Jerry and Nicola are joining us remotely.
No, Jerry's here.
Jerry's here. Sorry. Not remote at all, Jerry. You're sorry, but apologies for that. We're so used to screens in the 21st. No, don't worry. This is agenda item 2 is a declaration of interest. So members are obliged to declare any relevant financial or other interests at each committee meeting as applicable. Anyone an interest to declare? Obviously you can as we go on.
Thank you.
Agenda item 3, chairperson's business, of which there is none, except just to remind people that we included some correspondence in relation to the June monitoring round that I received that may be of interest to members. So that is included in the pack, just in case it's of interest and of use to people. Agenda item 4, draft minutes of the meeting held on the 16th of October 2024. At page 7 of the meeting pack, you will find the minutes. If members are content that they are a true reflection of that meeting, I will sign the minutes. People are content?
Great.
Okay, content. Great. So we will now move on, as I said, to a very fulsome list of matters arising. And obviously, people will have the opportunity. This is not the last and final opportunity to talk about any of these issues, just to reassure people. So, item 5.1, 5.2, I should say, are city and growth deals. So members requested the latest correspondence from the Chief Secretary to the Treasury to the Minister regarding funding commitments for the deals, and it's provided in the pack, so you'll see that. If there's any comments, obviously I think there is unanimity, relatively rare unanimity on trying to resolve the two outstanding funding issues on city and growth deals, and hope we get that resolved quickly. Okay, people are happy to move on. The next agenda item is the Baby Loss Certificate Scheme. The Minister, at page 16, the Minister informs the Committee that she intends to bring forward an enabling power in the Registration of Deaths and Stillbirths Bill to take forward a baby loss certificate scheme through secondary legislation. We previously noted that this may have an impact on bill timetable, but obviously we hope to move it expeditiously. People content with that? Okay. So we're going to deal with a few agenda items together as they are related. Those are department correspondence to us in relation to correspondence to the Committee for Justice in relation to the Civil Service Staff Handbook and Sickness Policy. The Committee for Justice correspondence in relation to the Civil Service Staff Handbook and NIC's sickness and absence policy. So we'll do the three of these together. So firstly, if you turn to page 17 of the meeting pack, the Committee for Justice wrote to the Department requesting further information in relation to the NIC's sickness absence policy in relation to psychological and mental health issues. This committee has been copied into this response, and linked to this is, as I said, the correspondence from the Justice Committee to the Department. I presume that's the Department of Justice or of Finance?
Department of Finance.
Department of Finance, outlining its concerns on the treatment of PTSD in the NIC's staff handbook. The committee has asked DOF for detail on a number of issues related to how PTSD is treated, processed and managed in the Northern Ireland Civil Service. We will be copied into the response, and it will be brought to our briefing from officials on these issues on the 20th of November. So just to remind people
just what I'd flag up on that
just
one, Chair, is we've already seen that because we asked beforehand. So we do have feedback already on that issue, and that again will be put into the pack for the 20th.
So just to say, we will have that meeting, a briefing from NIC's HR on the 20th of November. 5.5 is NIC's sickness absence policy and post-traumatic stress disorder again. So the committee requested information on how PTSD is addressed in the NIC's sickness absence policy in relation to prison office staff and more generally. Obviously this chimes what's happening in the Justice Committee. The Department has indicated the sickness absence within NIC's is managed on an individual case basis with no set procedure for the management of cases based on the reason for absence, e.g. PTSD. Support for staff with PTSD includes the NIC's Employee Assistance Programme, Critical Incident Stress Management Process and the NIC's HR Welfare Support Service. The response will be brought back to the November 20th meeting. Okay, so the next agenda item is on the NI Fiscal Council bill. During the oral briefing on that bill, members discussed the ONS recommendation on the classification of the Fiscal Council, which is established as an NDPB, like the Office of Budget Responsibility. Officials have confirmed the classification of the Scottish Fiscal Commission was different and indicated that they would provide further detail on this point, given the close alignment to the NI Fiscal Council model. This clarification has now been provided and will be added to our evidence base for the committee stage of the bill in due course, and I think that will be important because a lot of what we do when we scrutinise it will be comparing other fiscal advisory councils. I personally think that given we are also a devolved administration, there is reason to look and interrogate why we're using the model for the OBR rather than the Scottish Fiscal Advisory Council, the Scottish Fiscal Commission, sorry, which is slightly more aligned to what the NI Fiscal Council does. But we will be able to talk about that when we have a bill to scrutinise, and we will obviously be providing our views on that. Okay, if people are content, we will move on. The next agenda item is the Law Commission report on apartments. There is a report from the NI Law Commission on apartments. The Law Commission published this report in 2013, and within it there are a series of recommendations on how to address legal problems and address management problems. So the Deputy Chair raised this report during an agenda item on 9th of October, and I don't know if you wish to speak to it or you're happy enough to note at this stage, Darren. Okay. Well, it's there for people to interrogate. Okay, 5.8, link cash access assessments. These are current cash access assessments compiled by Link of Belfast, Collinswater, the Collinswater area just down the road from here, and Downpatrick. We discussed this when we had them in front of us a few weeks ago. So they will explain how you can look at those assessments, and they can explain how it will explain and unpack how the cash access assessment happens, and that feeds into obviously the work of Cash Access UK and some of the other things we've been looking at. People happy enough with that? We'll note it at this point. Okay, agenda items 5.9 to 5.11 and 5.16 to 5.17 are Hansard transcripts. So members, if you I'll refer you to various parts of the pack. I won't go through them all in detail, but there are Hansard transcripts for the fiscal framework session we had, for the NI Fiscal Council session, and for the draft programme for government session, all of which were on the 3 weeks ago on the 2nd of October. It was a busy and long session, and then the week after that we had cash access at UK and the Financial Services Union. So there are Hansard transcripts for both of those. If people are content to note, they'll obviously form part of our evidence going forward, including for the Financial Services Inquiry. Okay, the next agenda item is from the Department of Finance on the October monitoring round. The Department of Finance has commissioned the 24-25 October monitoring round from departments. Returns are due by Friday, the 25th of October, i.e. in about 48 hours' time. The clerk has alerted clerks from other statutory committees that they may request information from their respective departments. The departmental responses to this summer's urgent in-year exercise will also form part of the October monitoring round. Therefore, the starting point for this exercise is the September position, which includes reduced requirements submitted in the urgent in-year exercise after the outcome of the June monitoring round. Departments have been given the go-ahead to bid for additional capital DEL and financial transactions capital. Capital DEL bids submitted in the urgent in-year exercise will not be carried over into October monitoring, and members will have an opportunity to question officials on this further during the scheduled budget briefing on the 6th of November. But I would say in passing, it is perfectly in order to ask the Permanent Secretary of the Department about this when he's in front of us in a very short period of time, because it's quite a big issue. Okay. So people are content with that at this point.
Chair,
yeah, go ahead.
Just to repeat again, the duty on departments to furnish their committees with that information in a timely fashion. In fact, I can't just remember the specific time.
7 working days.
7 working days. Thank you very much.
I was in law. Someone had an amendment to that point. I can't remember where that came
we
from.
flag that up to the other committees in bold.
Thank you.
Well, the departments will be very bold if they don't provide the information within 7 working days, as the law provides. Anyway,
Sure.
yes.
Just to highlight, too, we're looking at the outturn figures. It definitely is worth asking because they're now reporting over commitments of £812.3 million, whereas whenever the emergency exercise was conducted in August, it was 769 million. So it has gone up since last month, or this is September, so it was August's investigation. So the September reported figures have gone up by some £50 million.
Indeed. Okay. You're content. The next agenda item is a WMS from the Minister on a cash access for the Department of Finance from the NI Consolidated Fund during October. Further details in the WMS, which was laid in the Assembly on the 17th of October. The Department indicates that this was, quote, to ensure they also have sufficient cover in place to meet any unforeseen expenditure that may materialise during October. I presume that one might argue that would argue that a monitoring round would be welcome if there's if they're having to make cash advances. Okay, members agreed to note that and forward it to the Education Committee. The next agenda item is ministerial engagement with UK financial services bodies and banks at page 248 of the pack. The Department has replied to the Committee's request for information on work the Minister has commissioned in regards to banking and financial services, indicating that the key focus of its work is in relation to engagement with stakeholders and industry. The Minister has been briefed on key matters including bank branch closures, access to cash services and the increasing cost of insurance. Devolution of financial services responsibilities is not a matter that has either been raised or considered. The Department has also indicated that the Committee will be updated following the Minister's Autumn Roundtable on the 20th of November, which is helpful. And obviously we are then hearing from the Minister herself the week after, so we can ask her about it there. Okay, the next, if you're content, the next agenda item is from the Welsh Finance Committee, which is on fiscal intergovernmental relations. The committee has been sent a copy of the Welsh Finance Committee's report on fiscal intergovernmental relations. The report has also been shared with the Treasury Committee, the Welsh Affairs Committee and the Minister of Finance, who provided information on dispute with the UK Treasury in relation to the funding of the Troubles Permanent Disablement Scheme. A plenary debate is scheduled for 11th of December in the Welsh Senate, which is to note, and I would just say in passing that members, myself and the Deputy Chair and the Clerk participated in an informal discussion along with the Chair of the Executive Office Committee yesterday with Tanya Antonazzi, who is the incoming Chair of the NI Affairs Committee at Westminster, and raised that this was something that we had talked about and we were talking about to our counterparts in Cardiff and Edinburgh in terms of better working together and indeed pushing to where possible, it's not where possible, pushing to get evidence sessions and proper briefing from UK government ministers, and I hope that will yield benefits at some point. That's just really information to note at this stage on that. The next agenda item is the International Investment Summit and National Wealth Fund. Members, I think we may be coming back to this at some point. This is a page 4 of the tabled pack. Members requested details of interactions the Department have had with the UK Infrastructure Bank and related institutions. Department officials have had a number of direct engagements with UKIB representatives or with Treasury officials in relation to the UKIB, including initial engagements to understand the bank's remit and role in relation to Northern Ireland. There has also been more recent engagement with the UKIB's NI representative along with the Strategic Investment Board to discuss the opportunities and barriers to bank support in NI. Since July 24, officials have had initial engagement with the Treasury regarding the remit of the proposed National Wealth Fund. This included providing views on how the current UK-wide public financial institutions, particularly the British Business Bank and UKIB, interact with devolved government activities, an assessment of the key challenges in terms of the UK public financial institution landscape, and around what priority functions of the new NWF should be. Can I suggest we may discuss this in more detail? I think we will need to have an evidence session or build it into an existing evidence session with a relevant official. I think this is something that we haven't, as a committee, properly interrogated yet. And there's another relevant bit of information is a report which was produced by an organisation called UK and a Changing Europe, which is an academic organisation that showed how much not direct funding in the way that Peace Plus was, but how much underwritten infrastructure lending had been lost to this place post-Brexit, because we're now no longer, we can't avail the European Investment Bank, and this is the UK replacement, so we need to understand what it's doing or isn't doing. If people are content, at some point we will we'll have that as a holding action with the department to get a detailed update, but that's useful. So members, the next agenda item is on building regulations and associated matters. The committee agreed to schedule a further written briefing from the department in relation to fire safety and wider reforms of the building regulatory system, now scheduled for 25th of February. Is that we're going to get? It's an oral briefing we're going to get on 25th of February?
Yeah.
Yeah, okay. Officials have indicated that DOF is not taking forward work in relation to mica pyrite defective block matters. The failures appear to relate principally to issues associated with defective products. Regulation of the standards for construction falls within construction product regulation. A reserved matter is overseen by the Office of Product Safety and Standards. The Department for Communities has been engaging with OPPS and have provided comment for the committee. DFC officials have highlighted that 6 social homes have been remediated, and they are aware of 1 private homeowner affected by defective blocks. DFC reiterate that there is currently no evidence to suggest that defective blocks pose a systemic issue here. However, officials will continue to monitor the situation. That is to note, and I might just suggest that we share that with the Committee for Communities. I would just say that, I obviously hope that is true, but I think there has been a kind of long-standing concern that, particularly in Tyrone, Derry, right next to Donegal, where this is a systemic problem, some of these, lots of builders are cross-border and the border's not really there for them, that this is something that we just need to be absolutely belt and braces on and completely assured that it isn't as much of an issue as we might fear, but we can share it with the Communities Committee. I think people are content. Okay, the next agenda item is dispute resolution on which we've kind of mentioned this already. This is in relation to the Troubles Permanent Disablement Scheme. Officials have indicated that they held a meeting with Treasury officials on the 1st of October. Those officials were unable to provide a precise time frame for the resolution of a dispute in relation to funding for the Troubles Permanent Disablement Scheme. The Minister raised the issue during a bilateral meeting with the Chief Secretary on the 3rd of October. So members, that is to note at this point, but it is obviously disappointing that it still isn't resolved now many years on. Okay, the Department of Finance, the next agenda item is around the Shared Prosperity Fund. That is at page 8 of tabled packs. Members sought an update on all UK government funds which replaced EU funding. It is indicated that the department officials have provided technical advice on guidance to enable funding to flow, but that the department does not hold information on what funding has been received by organisations or remains unclaimed, as they do not deliver or manage these funds directly. That is the role of the Ministry of Housing, Communities and Local Government, a department which has changed names. I'm trying to think of an entity which has changed names more often than that, and I can't think of one a lot. The MHCLG. The Minister has called for the spending power currently exercised by MHCLG to be made available to the Executive in line with the commitment made in the Labour Manifesto. The Department of Finance has set out options to MHCLG to prevent a financial cliff edge for those currently in receipt of funding from the SPF. It is indicated that decisions on the way forward are subject to funding decisions in the Treasury budget at the end of October, i.e. this day next week. An update will be given to the committee following this. So I think it's really important that we do get and scrutinise, and we will bring that back, so we will hopefully have a clear sense of what the policy direction is. Obviously, you would hope the UK government will eventually have a clear direction on what's happening with these replacement funds, and then we will be able to interrogate how that rolls out locally. So that is to note, and we will raise the issue during the post-UK budget briefing we have scheduled for the 6th of November, if members are content. Yep. Right. So then the next thing in our diary is that, the next thing on our diary in Manager Rising is around appointments. The department's provided a list of all current the department has provided a list of all current permanent secretaries and deputy secretaries across all NICS departments. Information has also been provided on the public appointments process. Responsibility for this process lies with the Executive Office, but each department is responsible for making its own appointments in line with the Code of Practice for Ministerial Public Appointments, which has also been provided. Which has also which has also been provided. Sorry, excuse me. So that's really to note at this stage. It is useful information, but it is to note unless anybody wishes to make a comment. No. Okay, we'll move on. The next agenda item is from the department, and it is the budget sustainability plan. The department has indicated that no issues were raised by the Treasury in relation to a delay in the publication of the sustainability plan and 24-25 income generation measures. And the 24-25 income generation measures, with final decisions around 25-26 measures being taken once budget envelopes are known. Decisions are for each minister to take, and decisions about the level of the regional rate being taken by DOF as part of the budget setting process. Diane wants to come in.
You, Chair, and just on this, I just wanted to highlight, you'd mentioned we had met with the incoming Chair of the Northern Ireland Affairs Committee, and this was something that we had raised. So obviously we were concerned as a committee about the appetite for missing deadlines with respect to budget sustainability plan, but it was something that Matthew and I both had raised, that we would be really keen to get speaking to representatives from the Labour government or their officials as to what their appetite and attitude is to the full financial package that was agreed by the previous government in their handling of it, because it seems that as this point here being made, that there was no issues around missing that deadline, and the minister seemed to have been able to speak to that at the time. But it would be really good for us as a committee to understand whenever this new government has picked up the financial agreement, what their feeling is on it. So that was.
Chair, we did have correspondence before that obviously fell with the last government. If members were agreeable, might this be an opportune moment to write again, setting out the issues that the Deputy Chair has outlined in terms of, does the new government view the package in the same way?
Yes.
Is there anything new happening with it? Do they have other perspectives on it? Because obviously if they do, the committee will need to understand that in terms of its scrutiny.
Well, I think the fact that this is not to be snide about the deadline being missed, but the fact that these deadlines were kind of big immutable deadlines that were in stone, and then no one seemed to care when they were passed, I think speaks to an asymmetry of sort of interest in some of these things. And I think we need to know what is actually happening. What are these conversations? Are they just low priority for incoming ministers in the Treasury? I don't think that's particularly encouraging, particularly when you combine it with what's happened with city and region deals. So I think from our perspective as the scrutinising committee, to be honest, at this point I would kind of be minded to start to write to the Treasury and ask them for their views if people are content with that. Because I think at this stage we now have this new UK government in, but we don't really have any clear statement from the Treasury about what their perception is of any of these things, and I think it's for us to get it on the record. And if it forces an official to write it down, I think that might be useful, and it might be useful for the minister too if people are content.
And Chair, as well, and in the conversation yesterday, I was asked, is this a very real cliff edge in 2 years' time? And I outlined in detail, the public sector pay, the recurring nature of the spend, and I think that any opportunity that we can have to speak to the new government around the package and the items included in it, it would be great to make our representations.
Chair, are members content then to ask for officials to come as per the previous letter?
I think so, yeah. I think so, and I think it gives us an opportunity to put them on notice that we intend to do our scrutiny role, and they and given that they, as the point we've made repeatedly, there are officials who are making hugely substantive decisions, sometimes without consultation with DOF officials here. And there's clearly limited scrutiny in London of what is happening there. So I think it's totally reasonable for us to push back.
And the other thing
for us to ask
comes to mind is that letter was a similar letter was also sent then to the NIO requesting officials, because obviously the NIO had a role as well.
Yeah.
And the committee had also got to the point where the letters were copied to the previous Northern Ireland Affairs Committee, and they did put in questions about why we hadn't had responses, and obviously the response came back no. Does the committee want to do that again, copy those to the new chair of the Affairs Committee?
Yes.
Just to reinforce that they might be able to help, if members are content?
Yes, agreed.
Okay.
Content, if members are content with that, yeah. Okay. The next agenda item is HR across NICS and outsourcing of HR functions. The department has provided detail on the structure of NICS HR at 2024. In NICS HR, there is a total of 468 staff in post with 56 staff in people and organisational development. All HR functions were centralised in April 2017, but some departments have designated staff with HR or organisational development, people-related functions. The department does not hold information on this, nor have responsibility for this. So out of a, give or take 20,000, civil service of about 20,000, just under 500 are working in HR, as in their whole job's HR. There are some people who have an element of HR in their post, but they cannot. The data is hard to reach. But those are the people who are dedicated HR staff, I think, is the information. People are content to note that. The next agenda item is departmental overcommitments and risks. So members, that's page 64 of the tabled pack. The department has indicated that there will be a significant degree of certainty over the executive's final 2024 to 2025 budget position on the 30th of October 2024. Barnett consequentials will be confirmed then. Once the budget outcome is known on the 30th of October, the Minister intends to announce the October monitoring exercise in early November. The announcement of that outcome, will be made soon after executive agreement. Members are content to note that. We will obviously be requesting that we get an immediate update on the outcome of October monitoring, and we will further questions will be raised with officials on 6th of November whether or not the monitoring has been agreed and published by that point. Okay. Next agenda item is on the office estate strategy update. Now, again, so we can come back to a lot of these things. People should be assured that they will have the opportunity to come back should it be necessary, and we'll be coming back to some of these things. On the office estate strategy, there is an update on properties which have been sold. They include Cookstown Social Security Office for 330,000, and a large sale which is Netherley. I don't know, is that information in the public domain about
There's a giant sold sign.
It has been sold, but it's definitely been sold. But I don't know if the amount has been sold. And there are other properties, Clarence Court and Victoria Hall, properties in the Falls Road, Ann Street, College Street, and Fermanagh House have progressed through the internal disposal process. I would be keen to understand just more in terms of the. So we have a document which is the Civil Services Office Estate Strategy. I think it would be helpful at some point, but it's not urgent, to get a mini briefing on.
Sure. We follow up because we did get an initial one when we were told of all the sales that were going to happen, and now obviously some of those are going through.
Yeah, Diane Forsyth, the Deputy Chair.
Yeah, thank you, Chair. Just on that, I think that it would be good for the committee if we were able to request the full audit trail on both of the sales that have completed the process by which was gone through. Was it D1? Was it open sale? How many bids were in? Who it was sold to? So basically the full, so on Cookstown Social Security Office, it was completed on the 11th of April. Full paperwork should be there for us to be able to see it, to scrutinise it, and also with Netherley, just the 27th of September once again, in terms of what was the process, how many people were interested, what were the bids, how was the department satisfied that it was a fair value. And obviously these other two, it says they're due to be completed late October, early November, so by the time we return we may have had more completions. I think we should ask for the full disposal report on all of those, just as the scrutiny committee, as to what the department exactly has done on those, if the committee is in agreement.
Yeah, I think that's reasonable if members are content with that. Okay. The next item is I think we've completed.
We have.
A Manager Rising.
And on time.
First for me. Okay. The next agenda item is the main business of the day, which is an oral briefing on the work of the Interim Public Sector Transformation Board. We are getting a briefing from the Permanent Secretary to the Finance Department, Jane Brady, the Head of the Civil Service, Aidan McMahon and David Hughes. But I also need to get a members' agreement that Hansard will record this meeting. I presume everyone's content with that. So members, if you turn to page 356 of the meeting pack, you will find a clerk's memo which has an update from the department regarding the committee's concerns about the scrutiny gap between the work of the interim board and the urgent need for timelines. The appointment of the board, a reply from the Minister regarding the timeline, composition, terms of reference and the role of the Public Sector Transformation Board, July, August and September updates on the Transformation Board's work, which starts at page 365 of the meeting pack. I should also say we have other meetings, other briefing papers. We are going to on issues which may come up. We obviously will hope that the officials in front of us are able to any other ancillary but important issues that come up. One is the NIAO report on the non-domestic renewable heat initiative incentive scheme and the reform package which flowed out of that. That's at page 461. The CNAG has obviously outlined some concern with the pace of progress in relation to the department. There is a news article relating to same. There was also correspondence which I shared from yourself. Thank you very much from the Head of the Civil Service in relation to, in my other capacity, in relation to the June monitoring round which I shared with committee colleagues, which may also be of interest. That's at page 619. So members, we did previously ask the department for a copy of the correspondence from the chair of the interim board to the Minister, and the department replied that it would not be appropriate to share this level of detail in advance of the executive having had the opportunity to fully consider the proposals recommended for funding by the Finance Minister following advice from the Interim Public Sector Board. So that is that's where we are now, but we are going to get an update from the officials. So welcome to the meeting, and we have very busy people who are here to brief us, so we thank you very much for your time. Jane Brady, who's the Head of the Northern Ireland Civil Service and Chair of the Interim PSTB, Neil Gibson, who is of course the Permanent Secretary at the Department of Finance, Aidan McMahon, who's Director of Fiscal Policy Division at the Department, and David Hughes, who's Head of Corporate Services. So welcome all, and thank you very much. We've always had lots of discussion, and we've had papers on the PSTB, albeit not the specific letter, but if you wanted to give us a brief opening statement, and in the politest, nicest way, the emphasis is on brief, it would be helpful, and then we'll go for questions. What I've suggested, members, in advance is that if we group our questions thematically, we don't always do this, but I think if we have questions first on the Public Sector Transformation Board, we'll then have questions on the NIAO and the report on RHI, and then after that any other ancillary matters that members wish to raise, as always within reason and within bounds of relevance and courtesy. But over to you to give us an opening update.
Yep.
Yeah, go ahead.
Thank you, Chair. Grateful to have the opportunity to provide an update to the committee on the work of the Interim Transformation Board and also the other matters that you raised. In particular, to update you on the Transformation Board and how it's been progressing, and I have a few points I'd like to make in a brief opening statement. As you mentioned, I'm pleased to be joined by Aidan McMahon, who's been supporting the work of the Interim Transformation Board and is the Director of Fiscal Policy Unit, Department of Finance, and also with my colleagues Neil Gibson, Perm Secretary, and David Hughes, Head of Corporate Services in Department of Finance. You'll be aware that the financial package for the Executive includes $235 million of ring-fenced funding for public sector transformation. Access to that funding is contingent on the establishment of a Public Sector Transformation Board, and that board considering proposals as transformative. The Finance Minister presented a way forward in relation to the transformation and this specific funding to an Executive colleagues on the 9th of May this year. The Executive endorsed the Minister's paper, and following that the Minister made quick progress in establishing the Interim Public Sector Transformation Board. As a board, we have met 7 times since it was established in May, and I'd like to place on record my personal thanks to fellow board members Judy Harrison and Francis Rowan for their dedication and professionalism in the process so far. In my capacity as chair of this interim board, I've also written to the Finance Committee on 3 occasions, on the 10th of July, 14th of August and 9th of September. I've also met the Finance Minister on the 3 occasions, apologies. I've also met with her on the 31st of July and the 22nd of October to discuss progress. I understand the Finance Minister and wider Department of Finance have been keeping the committee updated on the progress of the interim board's work through a number of written updates and a number of appearances at committee by officials. In terms of the updates which I've provided, these have included that during the first stage of our assessment, 47 proposals were received, and with all departments submitting proposals. This amounted to around 750 million in requested funding, 3 times more than is available through the 5-year period. Outlining an opportunity, the interim board saw to consider collectively the batch of digital proposals received to allow for a more strategic system-wide approach to digital transformation, and recommending the Department of Finance and TEO work together to develop a terms of reference for digital landscape review. That as anticipated, the interim board would want to engage directly with departments on the content of the proposals to understand them in more depth and provide feedback ahead of the second stage of the process. And to my most recent update, the Minister of Finance stated that 29 proposals have been selected by the interim board to move forward after we completed our first stage assessment. 18 of those are categorised as digital and will be included within the agreed digital landscape review, expected to complete around the end of this year, and 11 moved to a stage 2 assessment. As a board, on the 18th September, we met the 7 departments responsible for the 11 proposals moving to stage 2 to provide verbal feedback. Those departments were asked to submit a revised proposal to the interim board for a final assessment by last Friday, the 18th of October, with a view that advice can be made to the Minister of Finance as soon as possible thereafter.
Just to be clear, it's 11 of the initial 47 proposals. We're down to 11.
We are down to 29 proposals.
Sorry, the 11 is the digitally enabled ones.
29, 18 is those within the digital scope, and 11 to have moved to stage 2, which are outside the scope of digital. So that makes it.
Right. So it's 11 that aren't digital.
11 aren't digital.
Okay, fine.
Yeah.
There's still 29.
There's still 29. The 29 are being considered under the digital landscape review. The 11 have come forward with updated proposals from last Friday. And the Department of Finance are working alongside counterparts in the Northern Ireland office in addition to finalise the terms of reference for the interim board. Once our work has progressed and advice given to the Minister of Finance, the Minister will bring her recommendations to the Executive for consideration and agreement. To conclude, the reform and transformation of public services is vital to support and sustain the delivery of many of our public services and to improve our financial sustainability. While we know that the 235 million in funding over 5 years will in no way tackle the magnitude of issues at hand, it can be significant in helping to develop and implement a model of delivery which will stimulate the wider transformation of public services. The Executive are committed to reform and transformation, which has been recognised as a priority in their draft programme for government. That there is, of course, a breadth of work to be done to ensure we're successful in this. I'd like to recognise the work of Executive Ministers and Departments for their commitment and positive engagement in the Interim Board's work, which has progressed in relation to this element of transformation, and we are both all happy to answer questions in that regard.
Okay, thank you very much. Members, as always, indicate that you wish to ask a question. I suppose, first of all, to ask a relatively broad question, what do you mean by transformation?
So there was advice provided through the Finance Minister to the Executive for consideration in that meeting in May, and it was defined as 3 broad areas. Firstly, that fiscal sustainability aspect in terms of bringing our services under better fiscal sustainability and predictability. Secondly, transformation of services, both to improve outcomes but also in the matter of service delivery. And thirdly, in terms of cost savings, early intervention or prevention. So those are the criteria that were brought to the Executive for consideration, and those were the criteria that have been used by the Interim Transformation Board in terms of its evaluation, in addition to the analysis that the Department of Finance officials have done in terms of rating those proposals.
Okay. What is the biggest area of expenditure on Ardell in the Northern Ireland budget?
The most substantive areas, and 80% plus, come from health, and then from education and from justice. And
Health is the biggest part of the budget, isn't it?
Yes, and in fact, I think Raphael Bengoa indicated that would consume the entirety of the budget if areas were addressed by 2040.
And obviously, would health be the area that is where services are under most pressure, do you think?
I think there's a number of different areas that health would need to be considered in the round, as identified by Professor Bengoa. Firstly, there is the stabilisation of those services, and that would include the waiting list and provision and the unacceptable waiting list times that citizens in Northern Ireland have been experiencing, and that entirely is unsustainable. However, looking at the broader picture, there are areas of transformation in terms of that being the secondary level of care. How do we stem the tide of people ending up in those waiting lists? And that very much comes to that primary care initiative and that social care, which is what Professor Bengoa has identified, and indeed the Health Minister. But I think thirdly, and possibly the most important in terms of that transformation aspect, is 80% of the health determinants that cause you to arise in an accident emergency are predetermined by mostly your socio-economic upbringing, so that need for a wider approach, and indeed ministers have referred to that, the Health Minister has referred to that in statements as made, but those are indicated in the draft programme for government, that a preventative state, because many of those aspects are socio-economically derived.
And how much does the Health Department, remind me, have they bid for?
Perhaps Aidan can provide details of those packages.
Well, I would just say that the bids have changed from the initial stage 1 into stage 2. So there's been feedback from the Transformation Board, and as Jane mentioned already, we've got the revised proposals back in from departments. So the quantum of what departments are bidding for has flexed and changed over time. So it's not one static figure, if that makes sense.
What was roughly how much of the health want?
At the very start, I can check, but from memory, it was potentially in and around £160 million from memory. But I would need to confirm.
That would be the vast bulk of the 235. I suppose my question is, if we accept that health is the biggest, first of all, it's one of the most under stress in terms of public service delivery. We all know that. Secondly, it is the biggest area of Ardell spending, and it's growing. And as you say, Raphael Bengoa says it could take up literally all of our budget in the period ahead. Why not just give all the money to the health service and try and properly transform that?
I think it was to also reflect on Professor Bengoa's position, and of course that may be an assessment that ministers and the Finance Minister consider as a determinant. In our evaluation, it's looking towards the broader piece, and indeed representing that addressing waiting lists in itself will not provide a level of sustainability. It may address the current stabilisation issues, but particularly with our ageing demographic, where we anticipate that the number of people over 85 will have doubled by 2040, there needs to be a different way of approach in terms of that transformation.
But I suppose I don't necessarily mean that it all should be going on waiting lists, but wouldn't there be an argument to say, well, this should go on, we should devote as much of this money as possible to reducing costs in the health service, given that it is such a huge pressure, and is there a risk that you end up in a situation again where you're kind of, because of classic siloed Northern Ireland, you're kind of, everyone has to get a go, when the most transformational thing would be to properly focus on transforming the health service, and then worrying about things like, with the greatest respect to very worthy projects, small digital enabled things that could be funded out of other money in the Department of Finance or the Court Service?
Well, I would say, in terms of decision making, that is not a matter for the Interim Transformation Board to provide decision making. We are providing advice, and that advice initially will be for the Finance Minister, but it will be the Executive to decide. They have indicated the areas of priority, both in terms of the fiscal sustainability, which is a key aspect, the transformation of service in terms of outcomes and outputs for citizens, and indeed those cost to save directions. I think in terms of the issues of which provide that return on investment, my advice would be that it needs to be considered in the round in line with the core aspects. Some of those areas in terms of digital enablement can provide a significant return on investment even within the lifetime of this fund.
What do you mean by in the round?
Well, it would need to be considered as proposals for the Executive to consider in the round, as opposed to a specific approach.
You said that it would be for the Executive to decide on, for example, whether they just said, well, we're going to focus all this in the health service. We're going to say, there's 235 million quid here. Mm-hmm. No, that doesn't mean we don't want to transform other parts of the public sector, but we know that health is the biggest cost. We know it's where there's collapse and it's going to eat up all of our budget. Let's just focus on health. They can't decide that unless that's an option in front of them, and at the minute it isn't.
So the options have been defined that we're looking at, and the criteria we have been used to evaluate those have been defined and agreed, being provided by the Finance Minister and agreed by the Executive. We are not defined in our own parameters for this. We are taking the advice and governance. I would also say that in terms of addressing the health aspects, some of the aspects that the Health Minister has delivered in terms of improving the better outcomes and the wellbeing outcomes has focused on those areas of social deprivation, because actually the health outcomes are so predetermined at a whole of Northern Ireland perspective, with some of those significant determinants, particularly in healthy life expectancy, the difference of around 10 years between those in social economic derived areas and other outputs.
Okay, can I just ask before I bring in other colleagues, have any ministers raised any concerns about the a UK government civil servant being a member of this board?
So obviously the parties entitled to form an executive were part of the engagement in terms of the package of fiscal support. As part of that financial package, it was dictated that there would be representative from UK government officials.
It was dictated, so it was told to you by Christine Harris or a senior official?
So it was in the correspondence that was provided along with that package, so that was aware in advance of an executive being formed as a condition, and that has been played out in terms of that condition. I guess they're represented, and their nominee for that is a Northern Ireland Office official. As part of that, but understanding that was a condition and condition of the engagement with Treasury. I don't know whether Aidan, you have any.
Yeah, I was just going to say to reinforce that it was in the financial package. It was also in various correspondence to our minister from the CST, and it's a commitment within the interim fiscal framework as well.
Why did they want a representative on the board?
Probably a question for them.
But it was them that wanted it. This person wasn't recruited because they kind of spitball ideas because they're knowledgeable. It's because the Whitehall said they wanted this person.
UKG, as part of the package on offer, requested that there would be representation from UK government on the board. That was put, as I understand, to UKG to nominate who that is, and the person is an NAO official.
I think it's unusual that we're still in the stage where we have decisions being made in an interim board and a UK.
I guess just
yeah.
to confer that there are no decisions being made, and this is an interim transformation board, that we are providing an outline of what the executive has agreed as a criteria. We are evaluating, but ultimately the decisions will be for the Minister
It isn't
of Finance.
moving from ruling out some of the 47 and getting down to 29. That's a decision. Those are decisions.
Well, actually, that's advice that we're providing to the Minister to make a decision on.
The Minister could take that out of unfurl that waste paper from the bin, because I do want to do that bid that was rejected. If theoretically, do they have that as an option?
We're acting under the direction of the Minister and the Executive in that regard. Our advice that comes through to the Minister and indeed to the Executive, it will be for them to make decisions in terms of that approach.
Okay, thank you very much. I'm going to bring in colleagues now. Diane Forsyth, Deputy Chair.
Thank you, Chair, and thanks for coming to speak to us on this. We're keen to hear more about the work of the board, and I just wanted to ask, in the first instance, why is this board interim?
The matter for the terms of reference are our board at a ministerial level. We were keen as officials to make sure we could move as fast as possible and make progress on that. We've indicated we have met 7 times in terms of progressing those and moving to be in the position to unlock funding, of course under the basis of the Executive's alignment. I think there are discussions with the terms of reference are now with the Minister to consider and then to bring to the Executive in terms of refining that. But our view was an interim allowed us to get pace and to move. I think there's also, in terms of delivering, a view as an official that I would provide is that there will be learnings that will come out of this. There has been learnings already. There will be learnings what we will take from this committee and from the scrutiny that we will have. And I think that in the provision of interim, it allows us some further level of room to actually formalise that. I would say it has been, I think, a very significant positive experience in my engagement with departments of, addressing things in a different way, coming up with propositions which show that level of innovation. but acknowledging that it is a different methodology and a different cultural approach, honestly, that we have taken within the service. We also need to engage also with the Northern Ireland Audit Office, because the provision of some of these may have slightly different risk provisions. So we're very keen, and in fact we're meeting with the Audit Office the next number of weeks to refine their input into this process, which could then form the basis of a more substantive terms of reference transformation board. But indeed, you'd probably be minded that me as interim chair of the transformation board should not be putting in directly to what the governance vehicles is of a board that I'm sitting on. I don't know if you have any.
Yeah, I was just going to come in on top of that and just say the finance minister obviously was really keen to move as quickly as she could. So whenever the paper was agreed, the minister's paper was agreed at executive on the 9th of May, she moved very quickly, and within 1 or 2 weeks had appointed members to the interim board in order to make that quick progress. And while recognising terms of reference hadn't been agreed, I think the minister's position has probably been justified, in that we've made a lot of progress in the intervening period before the terms of reference have reached agreement.
So if the purpose of it being an interim board was to get it moving while the terms of reference are drawn up, would it be the position then that the interim board becomes the permanent board, or will there be a recruitment process for a new board?
I was just going to say, from our minister's perspective, she absolutely sees that the current board would be the foundation for any final board. So that's her expectation.
And what, Jane, would be your idea of the optimal size of the board, or would there be any additional skills to be brought to the board?
I think certainly, of course, more broadly than the transformation itself, the reform and transformation will require us to access different skill sets and different thoughts. And in fact, in the draft programme for government, ministers have outlined those areas, taking skill sets from UKG, from Whitehall, from North-South relations, and indeed internationally. So I would say the need overall for that transformation is that we need to have a panel of experts that we bring to those. Since I think it's my second time at the committee, since my previous visit to the committee, we have appointed our Chief Scientific and Technology Advisor, someone who comes from a very significant depth of expertise in science, technology, also entrepreneurship, but it also sits in a form of Chief Scientific Advisors for the UK government, and indeed deals with the Irish government. So we'll provide access to reference panels on that. I think in terms of learnings, and we're going to discuss later, potentially at your convenience, the RHI findings, but they talked about the need for those specialist expertise and the need to bring those in. And I think the reflections on the learnings of the Interim Transformation Board was the vast, significant number of proposals, that there were 18 of those in the digital space, and actually to rely on departments where we don't have that expertise to come up with the best idea. And indeed, none of us will be innovating, I think, very significantly in terms of digital innovation. We're not even fast followers from where the things are otherwise. So we felt it was really important that we actually commissioned specific experts to address this in an intentional focus. And maybe I imagine there'll be significant areas that we can engage from those areas. So the initial areas we have is that digital Chief Scientific Technology Advisor. The scale of the proposals, I guess, wouldn't, in my view, require a discipline set of covering all of the services, and they're more likely to be individuals that you would refer to for specific expertise. As part of building up the Interim Transformation Board, I have engaged with Whitehall colleagues in UKG, both in their current reform and transformation. I've also engaged with those who delivered the government digital services, as well as the Irish government officials as well, to inform that base. So as, in addition to having key contacts identified, like our CSTA, we do have reference to those other softer discussions. Again, the appointment of the board, the terms of reference will be with ministers and the executive to decide.
Thank you. And to build on the point the chair had made, in terms of this 235 million pot and the transformative nature, I just wanted to ask around to make sure that we have the confidence that these things are truly transformative and innovative. You obviously are sitting there with you have two hats on. You're chairing the transformation board, but also head of the civil service. Can I just ask, of the proposals that came through the transformation board, how many of those had you seen before coming through as bids from departments to digitise or improve their services?
I don't think I'd seen any of the bids before. I mean, I was aware of a number of programmes, I think, within Department of Finance in terms of the Integrate proposition. I know officials have shared those, and those are ongoing platforms of work, but I wasn't aware of any, in particular, of those aspects. They wouldn't come across my desk regularly in terms of bids. I think I'm obviously not an accounting officer for any of the departments, so I'm not signing off in terms of any fiduciary, unlike all other perm secs who would see those, I would imagine. I guess that's why Neil wasn't involved in terms of that decision making, because there would be no actual conflict, because proposals would not be coming from that office, and it was very important to us. I think in reflection, and the details were in the proposals that came through for evaluation, that indeed outside the digital, of which all digital were moved forward for consideration, the Department of Finance and the Executive Office did not have any successful proposals which were moved forward to that second stage. So.
Neil, perhaps just from his position, do you see did the Department of Finance bid for some of these things through the normal finance monitor and budget process and were unsuccessful?
Yes, there would be many of the bids within, as you would expect, within my own department I would have been familiar with, in some that were well known, Integrate being an obvious one, but others that were only in the sort of foothills of idea generation that would have come up in my engagement with staff. This was a real opportunity to maybe put a little bit of structure on some of them, get them into a slightly better shape. There were a couple came through that were fresh and completely new to me, but actually, to be honest, although we weren't successful as a department, it's actually been quite a useful process to start to help with the culture change as well, in terms of starting to think differently about what we might get money for in the future. And so actually it sparked a few other conversations at our board about, well, maybe we could join up on that, or, you know, some of the digital ideas. So actually it was quite a catalyst for bringing some new thoughts in, and perhaps even our feedback's been very helpful to help us understand where we came up short and what that means for me as an accounting officer to try and improve the transformation sort of journey within the department.
And I guess just reflecting on that, this is obviously the first year of an interim set up and taking the feedback. I thought there was 750 million bid in for 250 million, 235 million tops. There needed to be a filtering aspect. There were some proposals which were stronger than others, but actually all of them had merit, and I would anticipate that many of those proposals could be refined and come back. And indeed, the stages that we had with those who have come back to stage 2, there was verbal feedback given to them. There was a presentation on the day to each of the interim board members, and the revised proposals have come in which was reflected that, which are stronger enhancements. And I guess in many proposals would have identified a really strong, compelling need for transformation, but some of the proposals were stronger than others as to how they were going to provide substantive change, and that was the external scrutiny that actually was provided. Well, and so what will this deliver for this? Not just is this a really big problem, and it needs to be addressed. That's almost very clear from what we see in our services, Vice Chair.
No, thank you. And just finally, where you were saying you're not a decision-making body, just advisory, does that mean that the full 47 proposals will be part of a paper that goes to the executive, or will it just be the 29?
That will be for, I guess, the ministers to decide. She has indicated that she's content with the approach that's been taken with that. The further 18 that will form part of the digital landscape review, it's unlikely that will be completed before the end of, it'll be completed by the end of the year, so the timing may be out of review. We have provided feedback on those initial areas. The further substantive input has been on those further 11, and we'll be providing, we're meeting, allowing departmental officials to consider those proposals, and we're meeting the week after next to give our advice then to the Finance Minister for consideration.
Thank you.
Okay, Owen Tennyson.
Thank you, Chair, and thank you, Jane, for those answers so far. Just in terms of the budget that's been made available for transformation out of the financial package, is that still profiled in sort of 47 million over 5 years, or has there been any change in terms of the profile of that money?
Maybe
Yes.
jump in, Jane. So the Finance Minister, I think we recognised at the very beginning that it was highly unlikely that it would be absolutely on the head 47 million every year for 5 years. And so we have reflected that to Treasury officials, and the Finance Minister has also spoken to the CST in relation to that. So while we don't have any final decision in terms of what we expect for spend this year and into the next number of years, we know that it will be more lumpy than 47 every single year. So we've been flagging that with Treasury officials. So I think the expectation is on both sides that will be different.
Okay, and is there a risk this year that we end up surrendering money from the financial package? Or are
Certainly,
you
that's
confident that there'll be an agreement?
certainly that's not an expectation from our side of things. But we're trying to stay in lockstep with Treasury and in relation to the work of the board, and then advice to Minister, and where Minister takes that to the executive in terms of how that feeds in to budgets into the next year and following years thereafter. So we're not expecting it to be a problem.
And also, I guess some of the delays in terms of transformation board terms of reference have been caused by the change in government, which has obviously not enabled those discussions to progress. At an official level, we are progressing as far as possible, so there is potential to have funds deployed depending on the readiness of those proposals in this fiscal year. But it's unlikely that there would, in fact, it would be impossible to ever profile 47 million flat on each of the years. You would expect there to be a differentiate across all those areas. And of course the UK government official is also on that interim transformation board, so we'll be well placed to advise in terms of the readiness and availability.
Well, that's helpful, thank you. In terms of the criteria that the board is applying, one of the elements that is being considered is alignment to programme for government goals. How did your considerations within the board align with development of programme for government, and are you confident that the proposals that have gone forward to stage 2 actually do align?
Well, in the draft programme for government, it does identify the interim transformation board as part of the elements of reform and transformation, and it talks towards those key areas of service sustainability, particularly in health, to covered, and in terms of justice and education. So there is, of course, those alignments. The provision that we had in terms of the areas agreed by the executive, which informed those areas, were regarding the fiscal sustainability, which again is an aspect of the draft programme for government, the fiscal sustainability plan, and the revised fiscal framework, as well as those areas of service transformation and sustainability, which again are well rehearsed in health, education, and particularly in justice. And it also calls out those digital innovations within those areas. Again, it will be for ministers to consider that those are right, but also there's been substantive engagement in terms of the draft programme for government and the reform and transformation elements. I've been attending those with ministers. I have another one this evening with the Youth Parliament, just to hear those voices. And I guess the draft programme for government is not finalised, so there'll need to be obviously a reflection in terms of that once it does conclude in the next number of days.
And did the board have sight of the draft that has gone out for consultation before making decisions on phase 1, or was it very much a work in progress based on information available?
No, the board did not have sight of those before the public was aware of those in terms of that it was issued. Absolutely.
No, that's helpful. Just in relation then to the digital landscape review, can I ask you, Jane, to elaborate on what was the need for that particular review?
So it was reflecting that almost over a third of the proposals were in that digital space, and there were more substantive and smaller opportunities, but also reflecting that we do not have a core embedded expertise in each of the departments to covering digital. Again, that was a key recommendation from the RHI report, that we needed to have experts informing those areas, and the need to have a more strategic approach, and that we could be developing projects with merit in one area, but there is very significant potential for read across. Also in terms of looking as an element of transformation and the likelihood of cost savings that we could potentially look towards with automated intelligence and those areas that we needed to be better informed, and I guess that need for that expert perspective in terms of providing that. So that again, we thought there was significant risks to take a piecemeal approach, given there needed to be a more strategic.
And I'll maybe just come in and add on top of that. So when we got proposals in, when the board got proposals in from the departments, I think the board's seen that there was potential synergies in separate proposals in different departments. But naturally enough, those departments wouldn't have been necessarily linked up in relation to those synergies. So the board obviously made the decision then for that more landscape review to take a step back and look at that systemic approach that could be taken and thinking about digital transformation across departments and not just individual projects within individual departments.
And the number of areas that we would assess that the digital landscape review would be, firstly, assessment of digital maturity overall in the departments and understanding those areas, an assessment of what the landscape may be in terms of other regions, what other regions have done. Is there things that can be taken for those, within an assessment of those projects as well, with an implementation plan and potential recommendations to form that, and again with experts providing that.
I have time for one more just in this section, Chair, is that okay?
Do you?
Could I just ask you then to elaborate on who exactly will conduct that review, who will be involved, and also were alternatives to a separate review considered, i.e. Looking at adding additional panel members to the board, or, you know, contracting third-party consultants or something like that? What were the alternatives to setting up a separate review?
So it will be going through a procurement phase, and a business case has been written, so that hasn't been appointed yet. I think the view was it was more than, because of the reference that we had before, that kind of how those strategically align, what the landscape may be, what learnings may be from other places, required a specific area of expertise, and we anticipate that's a 8 to 10 week piece of work, so it would be a very significant proposition for someone to undertake as a panel member. I think I've been discussions also with the broader sector that you know, a digital, and the UK government has established a digital reference panel, that will probably be helpful as things progress, potentially for consideration again by ministers. So I think there will be a need for that resource. But again, this was a specific piece of work that was required across the service, which was more than representation. I think we've anticipated 10 working days for panel members at the moment. This will be bodies of work engaging with departments to understand the areas of alignment and opportunity.
All right, thank you, Chair.
Okay, no problem. Jerry, Carl.
Thank you, Jane, yourself or Neil, maybe for the first question. 29 of the proposals approved, 18 are digital. Do you have a figure of how many involve Fujitsu?
None. No. So the 18th approved aren't digital. So the 18th that are moved to the next stage as part of the landscape review. So there were 18 proposals of the 43. 47, yeah, which were digital. We just put those into to say these need to be assessed by someone in a broader strategic context. None of them actually were supplier led. Yeah. Their views from departments. Some of them at a very kind of rudimentary, kind of level of.
So no involvement of Fujitsu in those approvals, no?
No, we've had no involvement.
No problem. That's fine. Yeah. And then obviously going on to the previous question, there's been obviously pushing of Treasury to sign off on the terms of reference. What's the hold up again on getting that sign off?
Well, obviously there was a change in government from a UK perspective, so the terms of reference initially were being considered and discussed with the previous government, and then that had to, if you like, start again with the new government coming in, so that's certainly part of it. But as Jane already alluded to earlier in her comments, there's a terms of reference now sitting on our minister's desk for consideration, and officials will be meeting the minister to discuss those in the next couple of days.
So the new terms of reference are with the finance minister?
Certainly with the finance minister, from her perspective, at a point in time she will need to bring those to the executive as well. Okay,
and then maybe Jane or whoever on this question about the role of the NIO permanent secretary on their board, like what role does she play? I mean, is there a vote? If there are votes as valid as everybody else, is there a veto mechanism? Presumably it's all done by consensus, but I'm curious as to what role her status on that board plays.
Well, I guess it's identified that was part of the fiscal package for the restoration of the executive, so there was a requirement on the communication from the Chief Secretary of the Treasury with the package in addition. They have nominated a representative from the Northern Ireland office. They have an equal representation to other members of the board. At this stage, we haven't agreed the terms of reference for that, so that will include areas where there has been, where there may be disagreement, and whether that be voting or consensus or those different areas. I would have to say that there hasn't been any areas of non-consensus that it has been at this stage, and as you'd imagine, that's what you'd wish to have as well on that board. But there's
equal membership and no votes, no veto.
The terms of reference obviously to be agreed. So the terms of reference aren't settled at this point, but I think Jane's point is that there has been consensus across the panel to date.
As on the internal board, there's equal membership. Everybody's an equal member on that. Nobody's vote is more powerful than anybody else's. No.
That would be a consideration for the terms of reference if it did.
But at the minute, though, the NIO permanent secretary sits on the interim board.
It's an interim
Yes,
board,
right.
and to this moment there has been consensus.
Okay, so there hasn't been
we
any votes or
haven't-
disagreements.
We
okay.
haven't had any votes.
And then obviously, I think Aidan, if I picked you up correctly, I think the terms of reference are likely or similar in terms of what the permanent board will be. I mean, is the NIO permanent secretary to be on that permanent board, or will there automatically be another British government appointee, or is that being looked at in terms of the permanent board? Or
I guess the finance minister's indicated that they're content that the final terms of reference may be aligned with interim, but that would be, I guess, a decision for the executive, and indeed there will be a discussion, I imagine, with UKG that they will need to sign off the terms of reference, because that was a provision of the...
And maybe just the final point is obviously it's the UK government, and it's for them to nominate their representative in terms of the board, as opposed to the finance minister. So that's a decision for the UK government.
appreciate if the finance minister decided against a British government representative on that board, I mean, has that been considered, or what would happen in that situation?
I suppose it would be a political discussion between our minister, the finance minister, and the Secretary of State.
Okay, thanks.
Okay, Philip Brett.
Thank you, Chair. Thank you all for your presentations. David, just in relation to the proposals that were put forward to the board, have you seen a copy of them?
Sorry, I'm not related to that.
Okay.
That
Neil, have you seen a copy of them?
No, the proposals to the board, only the ones that are from the Department of Finance. So although Aidan has in the interim phase been offering some support to as a secretariat to the board, I don't see any of the bids from any other department.
You've seen them, Jane?
I have seen them.
And Aidan?
Yes, I've seen them.
So civil servants have seen them, but it's the view that elected members in this committee shouldn't be able to see them. Is that right?
The view that the executive took was that we would provide the initial analysis and advice to the finance.
Or was that view
finance
given
minister.
by the executive?
The view that
This committee shouldn't be allowed a couple of lines detailing the projects. When was that brought to the executive and an executive decision taken on that?
not in terms of, I guess, the provision
So my
of...
concern, Jane, is just that, you know, as a scrutiny committee, we're entitled to know what these projects are. And I know that you've said that the board aren't decision makers. We've gone from 47 projects down to 29. So that is a decision, in my view, that's been taken. In terms of then the 18th of October, which were revised proposals were to be submitted, were they just on the 11 stage 2 projects?
That's correct.
Right, so if you're saying that you haven't made any decisions in relation to projects that aren't viable, you've only asked for ones to be taken forward to stage 2 of the 11. So the 19 that didn't make it through to that stage have not been able to resubmit, change their proposals at this stage or the amount of funding that they're bidding for. So that is a decision that the interim board has made.
That's been agreed by the finance minister in terms of
That's
the
fair enough.
advice.
That's been
So,
agreed by the
and
finance minister.
I guess
But the point is that you said to the chair that the board isn't making any decisions. You have made decisions.
we have provided advice to the finance minister, who has made that
So
decision.
you're saying then the finance
it's-
minister made the decision of the 47 of taking the 47 projects down to 29.
The finance minister has accepted the advice of the interim
What does-
transformation board. But I guess
What
just also
date then
to...
did the finance minister agree that the 47 projects should be whittled down to 29?
She will have received the advice, which is
Yeah,
the
so
current
what date did
status
she make that
from
What date did she make the decision signing off that the 47 should be brought down to the 29 and that only those that are at 11 stage 2 should be asked to resubmit or be able to change the amount of funding that they could apply for?
I mean, it's a condition in the financial package.
I know it's a
and
condition, but I'm just asking when the
and
finance
it's
minister made
it's
the
the
decision.
CSTs.
Yeah, no, I know that, Ian.
Obviously, that
But when did
have
the
said it's the board that has to push forward those proposals
Yeah.
that it considers to be transformation, and that's what the executive and the finance minister agreed on the 9th of May. So that's the function that the board are carrying out.
Get that, and what date did the finance minister, as the head of the civil service, have said, make the decision that the 47 would be brought down to 29?
She will have got correspondence from the
You don't know what date she
public
made the decision?
Well, I'll have the correspondence, which I think the committee will have been informed of as well from officials in DOF to say these are the list of projects that are in the 11, and this is the list of projects that are in the digital transformation space as well.
Yeah, but there was no expressed view in any of the letters that were sent by the Minister of Finance to this committee to say that she had made a decision on those projects. So it's just if the line's coming from the board that they aren't decision makers, that just then needs to be backed up with when those political decisions were taken. In relation then to the 18th of October, what's the financial variation then in terms of the bids that have been made on those 11 projects?
We don't have that aggregate figure at this point in time. And the Minister won't have that aggregate figure at this point in time either.
Okay, when will the Minister have that figure?
Well, obviously the board are meeting on the 7th of November, and the board will be considering those new proposals, and then will advise the Minister at that point in time what the current situation is.
Sure. So I know that they'll obviously be considering those proposals, but someone's bound to know now. The 18th of October was what? Last week?
Friday.
Yeah. So no one's calculated the changes or what the new...
Well, there was a couple of proposals that were slightly delayed, so the last one came in yesterday. So while we have that information and those figures, it hasn't been calculated at this point in time.
And then finally for me, which department failed to meet the deadline of last Friday?
I don't have that information at hand, but...
Was it just one department that failed to meet the
I
deadline?
don't have that information at hand.
I get this, but listen, we've as a committee have been clear that we wanted to get information on this board for some time, and have been trying to arrange it, and you would have thought that some of this information would have been available to the committee at this stage. Thank you, Chair.
Thank you. I think it's worth just saying we still haven't seen the letter that was referred to, the September letter. I believe is the one that we still haven't. We're more than happy to receive a copy of that at some point. Nicola Brogan. Nicola, can you hear us?
She's waiting. She's waiting.
We can't hear you yet.
She's waiting.
It's a slow reaction. I don't understand.
Being nostalgic for 2020. Yes, we can
hear
hear
me
you.
now, yeah?
Yeah.
I had to wait for the host to unmute me. Thank you, Chair, and thank you, folks, for coming to the committee and for your presentation here this afternoon. It is very helpful to get this information, and we do appreciate you giving up your time. I just want to come in the back of a few questions there from Owen and Jerry and Diane, I think, about the membership of the board, or the interim board as it is now. And I suppose I want to kind of get an idea of how effective you think the board has been with the way it's been made up so far. And I suppose, is it easier to offer advice and come to your own decisions, having fewer people as members of the board, but yet seeking advice from experts when necessary? Do you think it is an easier kind of way to work that? And can you maybe offer some more information on the type of advice you have sought for and probably will seek from experts in the future as well, please?
Thank you, Ms. Brogan. I would say that it has been. I found it to be an effective process in terms of the ability to evaluate. I would give thanks to colleagues in the Department of Finance who provided analysis in advance of those areas. Obviously, there is broad domain expertise within some of the members of our board, but in terms of the framework that we're looking at, I think it was a really helpful aspect that, and again, set by the executive in terms of the areas we wanted to identify. I think it was a really clear area that consideration for that digital piece required some specific expertise, both from a strategic but also a joined up approach, which Aidan referred to. We've referenced the work of the CSTA, so we would anticipate bringing them into this review as part of that progress. I think some of the areas that we identified in terms of the feedback going back to the proposals was not in terms of the specifics of the service they were providing. It was the information that they had provided. Did this provide a return on investment? Was it clear what the outcomes were? How would this then provide some level of sustainability? So it was less on the specifics of the actual technical intervention and more on the structure of the proposal, and that's why it was really helpful to have the proposals being presented in addition to the kind of the framework that was provided as part of the executive agreed process. And I think going forward, that will again would take learnings from from obviously the progress of the Interim Transformation Board, the input from this committee and the output and workings of the executive. We've obviously kept departments appraised as well of the process.
That leads me on to my next question. Jane, you mentioned this a few times through your answers there about different lessons that have been learned throughout this process. So maybe you could offer some more information on the types of lessons that have been learned and maybe where it can go in the future.
No, I think that really helpful. I think there's been, I guess, lessons in terms of, I think the departments, I've engaged with PermSecs, have found the experience to be very positive, even those who weren't moved forward, and I guess that different way of thinking, which looks towards more of kind of that more innovation and identifying areas where we can provide that transformation. So I think that, in effect, we have had really positive, and colleagues can perhaps reference, and I know that Aidan had given input into that process. So I think there's a way of working that can be looked at as part of that process. I think if I look towards the lessons learned, this was with the view of making some potential for funding decisions in this year. I think there's a broader piece, and it's identified in the draft programme for government, is how we engage local government, community voluntary sector or ALBs in terms of that provision. And I think that would be a key area that could be factored into consideration for a following year with a confirmed or revised terms of reference. I think also the ability for a fund of this nature to deliver a vehicle for leveraging other funding. There is obviously substantive funding with Shared Ireland, Shared Prosperity, there's philanthropy funding. Indeed, that was identified as potential areas that this could crystallise. I think that could be delivered as a much more strategic focus. Peace Plus talks of the kind of the level of that level of transformation. So the ambitions of this programme align with some of the ambitions of those funds which are seeking to deliver and deploy money in Northern Ireland, and some of those areas have been out with the policy of the executive. So this can provide, in my view, a mechanism that could be explored to leverage further funding. So that would multiplier effect how we engage an all of government approach, how we embed when we do have an agreed programme for government, areas that we can make progress on that as well. So those would be my considerations. But I think, and again, I was not leveraging too much Professor Bengoa, but his reference was that it's not just about systems and structures, it's about people and relationships and how you get new ways of doing things and allow that area. I guess key in that will be our engagement with the Audit Office to understand the governance and the appropriateness of that governance vehicle and how we keep that. Aidan, you'll have had other experience.
Yeah, I guess the other point I would maybe add in something that Jane alluded to earlier on. I think departments found it really valuable, and I know that the board found it really valuable to have that day in Stormont Castle on the 18th of September where we had departments coming in and, if you like, pitching for their proposal. So obviously you have a pro forma and you have a proposal and a document in front that the board can assess. But there's nothing really better than and can substitute that kind of interaction with officials to kind of improve that depth of understanding of a particular proposal that's been put forward. And I think the board found that really useful, but I think the departments also found that really useful as well in terms of being able to give that depth of understanding in relation to what they were pitching for.
No, of course that makes sense, Aidan, doesn't it? As you say, to have that level of engagement, but obviously it work better for both sides. And that leads me on just to my final question, actually. And Aidan, obviously you've been working closely with Jane as a secretary kind of role. But what kind of level of engagement has the interim board had with the Department of Finance beyond that with Aidan, and then maybe with other departments beyond the likes of the applying to the Transformation Board? Has it been further engagement with departments?
Well, in terms of the Department of Finance, as we have tried to facilitate and help Secretariat, the Transformation Board. So generally the board hasn't, if you like, bled out into wider parts of the department. We have been providing that function sort of quite discreetly to the board, and obviously in and outside of those meetings that I talked about where departments came and pitched. Obviously Jane will have kept her colleagues at PSS up to date in terms of giving them a regular briefing on their Friday meetings about where the process had got to in terms of the Transformation Board, and the Finance Minister as well. Anytime there was correspondence from Jane representing the board to the Finance Minister. The Finance Minister would have been informing her executive colleagues. So hopefully all ministers and permanent secretaries were kept abreast of developments from that perspective.
And I guess in addition to be kept abreast, we've also made sure that we've kept it closed in terms of their insight into the proposal. So again, I'm not an accounting officer, and neither the accounting officer in TO, David Malcolm, nor Neil through his role, given that they were proposing bids, were party to the other bids as part of that consideration. As we create the structures in place, as anticipated in the draft programme for government for that reform and transformation unit and delivery unit, we are establishing resource within the executive office, and I have colleagues here with me today just to listen in and to take the feedback from this committee in terms of embedding that into the structures going forward.
No, that's fair enough, Jane. Listen, thanks very much for that there, and thank you, Chair.
Okay, thanks. Paul Fruit is next.
I'm really intrigued that you weren't able to offer up to my colleague Philip Brett an actual date when the Minister made the decision to rule out 18 government proposals from availing of this £235 million of spending. You've had time to collect your thoughts. Can you now provide me with that date when the Minister made the decision?
So, I mean, we can possibly, I guess, the Interim Transformation Board has taken a process as agreed by the Executive to evaluate the proposals. We evaluated them in line with the framework that was agreed by the Executive. We recommended the 11 and then the 18 move forward into further evaluation. We provided a summary of that to the Finance Minister.
And what was that, sorry?
And
I'll check the date, but it was in September from recollection.
So would that be the letter, Jane, that you wrote to the Finance Minister, which we haven't seen sight of? In fact, we've been denied by the department. Would that be the same letter?
I'm not party to what's provided from the Finance Department to this. Obviously, I'm here representing the interim as chair of the Interim Transformation Board, but I wouldn't be party to what was provided to this committee.
Yeah, I think the correspondence that Jane references and the information that the committee has got was that list of proposals that are through to stage 2 and the list of proposals that have the digital element that Jane's already referenced.
So the head of the interim board sends a letter to the Minister on the 9th of September outlining her advice, because it wasn't a decision. And then how did the Minister respond?
Well, the Minister will have responded, greeting the advice and encouraging the board to continue to work on.
What did the Minister say?
I don't have that correspondence at hand.
Is there a correspondence?
Well, the Minister has had a number of meetings with Jane and has shared a number of correspondences, and we had our most recent meeting yesterday to discuss the work of the Transformation Board.
So was it verbal?
No, the Minister will have responded.
Don't we think that the 18 proposals from government departments that were removed from the opportunity of getting £235 million of spending, do they not deserve an adequate decision process?
The Interim Transformation Board was given effect to provide that process of bringing through evaluation outlined by the terms that were agreed by the Executive.
So the interim board's work is to evaluate. The decision is with the Minister. It's very clear what we've said today. So we're just simply asking then for the actual date that the Minister made her decision.
Well, the Minister will make a decision, bring a recommendation to the Executive on those proposals that she recommends for transformation funding following the advice from the Transformation Board, and that has not taken place yet.
So it's not the Finance Minister's decision then, it's an Executive's decision?
Well, in terms of what is funded, ultimately the Board will provide advice to the Finance Minister. The Finance Minister will consider that and will bring a recommendation to the Executive to ultimately decide which projects are funded.
What did your letter say, Jane, the letter dated the 9th of September?
We're happy to provide information on that. I don't have that with hand. So provide further update on the Transformation Board, proposals moving to the next stage, proposals to include the digital landscape review, and proposals not moving forward to the next stage. And we provided a list of proposals in each category that were provided, and 29 proposals to move forward to either the next stage of assessment by being part of the digital landscape review, and should agree the next stages, and we will provide further feedback to those. We're happy, obviously, to provide this letter to you as well.
Why do you think that the Department of Finance denied us that letter?
I wasn't aware that that letter was not provided, so I think we can come back in terms of...
Maybe the Permanent Secretary would like to...
Yeah, let me come back on that.
To be clear, we did ask for the letter and we were not given it.
Yeah, look, there is part of this is sort of, trying new things, and one of them is, as we mentioned, I have to have a degree of freedom from that because I can't see and know about the other bids until they're assessed. So there's been probably a little bit where I'm not as privy to this as for reasons of trying to keep the right ethical walls. So let me come back on that to make sure the decision process that we took. But perhaps, and I would hold my hands up here, I've tried to be a little bit less involved, partly for that reason of being conflicted as one of the bidding departments, so I can't see what's in the letter to them before.
Well, I get the afflicted bit. I also get the agility that you're trying to inject. I really do. But that agility must come with transparency. And the fact that this committee wasn't even afforded that letter, we still don't know dates with regards to when ministers made decisions. We have been given no sort of assurance here today on that. It worries me that we don't have that. And we weren't even afforded a couple of lines to describe each project that had actually made it through the 29 proposals. We didn't even ask for the 18 proposals that didn't make it through. We only asked for a few descriptor lines of the 29 proposals that moved forward, and we weren't even afforded that. So whilst I like agility, it needs to come with transparency, because I will remind you, and we'll talk about this later, finding 86 of the RHI inquiry. The inquiry finds that the Edit Committee was not provided with sufficient adequate information to permit the Edit Committee to effectively discharge its scrutiny function. We're back to this report, folks. I'm alarmed. I don't know how you feel, Jane.
What I would maybe say in terms of the having a cut of information, if you like, from each of the proposals, the Department of Finance wasn't receiving those proposals. It was the board that was receiving them, if you like. So Neil has made the point that he never seen the proposals that came from all of the departments. So the Department of Finance, and outside of our role in supporting the board, we're not in receipt of all of the proposals that were put forward. So the Department of Finance proposals, obviously, we can speak about and give additional information on. but those departments, for example, in health, if we were to give a paragraph of information in relation to one of their proposals, we might misrepresent that, for example. And I think that might be a question to the Department of Health to provide their proposals, because ultimately they own them, as opposed to the Department of Finance.
That's not the reason you gave, though.
To touch on these things in our
So this is important. I was only making that recommendation. We're not going on that ground yet, Chair. So I get the separation, I get the distance, but then who's accountable for the interim board?
Well, ultimately, the executive has agreed the Finance Minister's proposal to establish an interim board based on the terms and the paper within.
When this scrutiny committee
on the 9th
requests information and it goes to the Department of Finance, and we can't get afforded a couple of lines of description because of the separation between the Department of Finance and the interim board, how is the interim board accountable? Who scrutinises the work of the interim board?
The interim board obviously reports to the Finance Minister.
Who scrutinises the Finance Minister?
Well, the Finance Minister then will bring recommendations to the executive.
My question was, who scrutinises the Finance Minister? It's this committee, is it not?
Yes.
So you can see the breakdown here.
And I guess I also, and I welcome your points in terms of agility, and obviously I'm here as the chair of the Interim Transformation Board operating on the direction. I think the areas of where we learn from this overall, and again our engagement with the Audit Office to make sure that we're feeding that into those areas. This is my 4th time in front of a committee. Since this executive has been restored, this is my 2nd time in front of this committee. I was the PAC 2 weeks ago in addition to the executive, so I really do welcome the scrutiny and input, and that is really critically important. So there is a learning aspect which I will need to factor in terms of the Interim Transformation Board, but ultimately there are decisions that are within each minister's provision as well.
So just the final question, so you'll be able to furnish us that letter, Jane, that you sent on the 9th of September, and every and all reply to that?
That will come, I think, via the protocol from the Finance Department and the Minister.
Well, protocol being as it is, I'm requesting it today.
It's obviously for the Finance Minister to decide whether she would release a letter that she has written, and Jane can obviously do the same from her perspective.
I'm just saying, bring in Deirdre, I think it is important to just put on the record there clearly a question about a degree. We appreciate the fact that we have received briefings and you're here today giving evidence, but there's clearly a question around the opacity of this organisation, the fact that it continues to be an interim board. There's a slightly philosophical, theological debate about what constitutes a decision. I do not think it is legit. I don't think it's a defensible position that eliminating loads of bids and then saying the decision has been made is, other than in the most theoretical sense, a completely understandable point. But I think we can clear all that up. Deirdre Hargey, before we move on to
just so to clarify, in terms of the approach for the interim board, that was agreed by the executive.
Yes.
They've agreed to that, and there's been no issues raised in the intervening period.
There's been no issues raised, and departments have engaged very proactively with the process through that. Yes.
And also that the work obviously hasn't finished yet in order to maybe furnish further details, so the decision still has to be taken by the executive.
Decision has to be taken, and no funding decisions at all have been made in that regard. All advice could be disregarded in terms of the funding decisions and different approaches taken.
And obviously once that's done, that information will be furnished to committees on request.
Absolutely, that would be furnished once it goes to the executive for consideration. Well, it will again be for ministers to decide in terms of that, but the official information we were provided is prepared for that.
Yeah. Thank you. It was just on the issue around the lessons learned, and I think we will be keen, because obviously you're saying this is a new process, it's different, and I was going to actually ask around widening at some point this process, and I know you touched on it, Jane, around other potential funds in terms of taking that more strategic look. So it would be keen when we're looking at the lessons learned, looking at the opportunities and potential if updates can be given to the committee around that. One of the things I was going to ask around, I know there was additional waiting for cross-departmental bids, and it was just to get a sense in terms of the breadth of the bids that have come forward, both on the digital side, but the other bids. Has there been much cross-departmental work as part of those bids?
Yes, I mean, to your first point, I think really welcome is how that could be dispersed further. We had a really helpful session with the Solace, with all the members of the council last week, and all Perm Secs regarding the consultation and interim programme for government, but how there may be joined up areas of working and where there is funds potentially in the city deals and etc. and the growth deals to align that level of funding and finding that new ways of working. The bids that came in, I think that largely some of them came from department, and they were obviously cleared by their minister in terms of coming through that process, but there were clear areas of synergy, and some of the feedback that we provided to those departments coming through to stage 2 was in terms of engaging broader in that sector, not just between departments, but indeed between kind of those ALBs and providers of functions. I think that's an area where we'd want to seek to get more joined up approaches as we go forward. Aidan, I don't know if you have any.
Yeah, I was just going to make the same point. Whenever we produced the initial pro forma, there was a question in there as to whether this was a cross-departmental bid and an intention to try and encourage that. To be fair to departments, they had a very tight time frame to come back with their initial bid, but since then and post the feedback from the board, that has been encouraged further, and I think Some of the feedback that the board gave to various departments was, should you engage with your counterparts in X department? And that has happened in an increasing level for stage 2 proposals that have come back in.
So I suppose that will be part of the lessons learned reflection then, because I think that would be important, that we get out of the silos, and as you say, sometimes you're just going through the pace of the work that you don't have time for those types of conversations. So if this gives that opportunity, I think that's a good thing. My last point was just one of the things, Jane, I think it was yourself said at the start around, I mean, I suppose it's the conversation, do you give it all to health? And obviously if we're trying to move more to prevention rather than treating ailments, whether it's in health, education, whatever, it was the point that you touched on in terms of deprivation and inequality, and the fact that we do have sections of our population that are segregated on the basis of social class, where people are down 10 years younger just by where they live, or they're seen as socially deprived. So I'm just wondering, as part of this process, notwithstanding in terms of when you're looking at transformation, in terms of fiscal sustainability, transforming services, and it's very much looking at the finances rather than the outcomes for people's standard of living, and actually trying to reduce those areas of deprivation and inequality. So I'm wondering where you're looking at a digital landscape review. I mean, if these things are coming up, these pressures in health and justice and education, is there the scope for a review that actually starts to target more around tackling inequality and poverty? And is that an emerging theme that's coming out across all of the projects, and thus the pressures within departments?
I think that's an emerging theme, obviously, inter-transformation we're looking at, but also the feedback that we received from the draft programme for government. We've had, I think, over 500 written responses in terms of those areas, and looking towards the areas that potentially may not be covered. I think some of the emerging aspects on that people mission is that, and it's not just life expectancy, it's healthy life expectancy, and prolonging that. I think what a really exciting aspect, I think, of the draft programme for government is the work that NISRA has provided in the wellbeing framework, the 10 wellbeing outcomes. I don't know whether members have looked at that, but it's done between the Section 75 groups, it's done by dependence, it's done by rurality, it's done by council, and then broken down by geography. So it's possible then to look within that areas to identify a more targeted type approach. And again, if you look where you have very constrained budgets and you can't do everything, targeting those who are most likely. And again, the evidence is clear that in some of those cohorts, in those areas, the outcomes are more highly likely to be based around social deprivation. So I think that's an area that could be explored with a more targeted approach. And the Health Minister has indicated in one of his work that he has been progressing through in terms of that better outcomes, it's actually clustering around those areas of social deprivation. I know the Education Minister has also looked towards those areas of social deprivation and the need to have a generational shift and early years intervention that can be seen. There'll be executive members have said there'll be obviously targets provided as part of each of the priorities, but also then overall, how are we shifting? Are things getting better and worse? And whilst we talk about housing and social housing, provision of more of that, an aspiration would be to put more money in people's pockets so there's less of a need of that in the long term. So looking at that immediacy of the issue, but also how we improve those outcomes. And I think that's a really interesting area. That's an area we discussed with our Solace colleagues. Could we actually look towards specific area interventions with cohorts of individuals, and the level of data and evidence that we have and can provide more meaningfully targeted provisions? Again, it will be for ministers to provide.
So there's an even greater duty then in terms of target and social need?
I think that will be for ministers to decide, but some of the outcomes that, in terms of that sustainable, if you look towards the health outcomes and the pressures that we're having, there's the global aspects of people living longer, but also the level of comorbidities, which are some of those predominantly led by social economic areas. So we know that the people from socially economic deprived areas have the worst health outcomes, and that creates a burden also in terms of some of the justice system as well as indeed special education needs. There is a clear data analytics that points towards those areas.
Thank you.
Okay, thank you. Now, members, we have the opportunity to ask about other matters. We have indicated that we wanted to cover some of what's in the RHI related report from NIAO and any other issues within reason, propriety and relevance and fairness to our witnesses who are giving us their time this afternoon. So just first on the NIAO report, which was published last week. It obviously has some quite stark findings. Just under half of the recommendations from the Cochrane inquiry are not being met, according to that report. Do you accept the findings of the NIAO report?
Absolutely, of course, accept the analysis performed by and findings of the Audit Office. I think 26 that have been met and 11 which are likely to be met, which would give an 88% in terms of the reference against those 42 recommendations. Obviously, there is more work to be done, and I am committed to lead that work along with officials across the department to drive forward in those areas. We have, we're happy to go into the various different areas of consideration, and I think that the areas that the importance of the Audit Office provide, and that scrutiny, I commissioned through the Civil Service Board at the end of last year an analysis and update in terms of those RHI recommendations, and you'll see in the report which the Audit Office has provided, there were areas which we felt had been delivered, but actually the important feedback that the Audit Office has provided is unless those are auditable, even though we have delivered, in our view, the action plan, that the need for those to be audited. So I am very confident that we can progress forward in order to delivering the outturn of those recommendations.
So neither you nor the Department of Finance will be disputing the areas in which the NIAO say implementation has not happened?
There are a few. We provided our most recent update here in March as well to the committee. There were areas that we felt, and we did have a good engagement with the NIAO about areas where perhaps we had felt, or I had certainly felt in my role as an accounting officer, that we had gone further than perhaps they had felt that we had done. But we've had a good discussion on that. We've read the report. Myself, David and the team will be preparing a paper for the Minister in terms of how we respond to that report. I think there's a lot of really valuable lessons for us. Jane's already picked up that point about what is auditable. We have considerable resource constraints in our audit function internally, so trying to get a more sequenced what can be completed and by when. Other thing I would say, Chair, is it's also important that some of the other things that are now underway, be it our new CSIRO information forum, be it our people plan and people strategy, it may be that some of these recommendations are being taken forward in a different vehicle now, so it'll be important that we provide a clear response to this report, which we're working on now.
And I guess just one point to clarify, I welcome the report and good engagement obviously with we're talking about the interim transformation, but I think on the 5 that are unlikely, my view is that those will be likely to be satisfied and delivered. Okay. So that may be a position where I imagine they will be positive regarding those in terms of the need for an audit train to provide. Just
for the purpose of getting all members in, keen for we'll keep questions brief and answers brief because there's a few things to cover. Why hasn't the subcommittee met since 2020?
I can perhaps bring David in terms of the terms of governance. Obviously it met at the end. David.
Very simply, that subcommittee was established to develop the action plan and make the recommendation of the action plan to the executive, which it did. It completed and as it fulfilled its terms of reference.
And the New Decade New Approach promised ongoing civil service reform coming out of that. Who owns that strand of work?
Yeah, well, that's interesting because the reform now, we're in the process. Jane can speak to the establishment of a delivery unit and a reform team. We obviously take a lot of that area forward in Department of Finance because we hold a lot of policy levers. We operate under a sort of memorandum of understanding. We're looking to refresh that as well so that we can have, and we'll be happy to provide further details on the broader family of reform and change, which includes many of these recommendations, but also many things beyond that as well. And
I would anticipate that reform and transformation will come under the draft programme for government. Obviously that's clearly defined in terms of those areas, and the executive have committed to annual reports in terms of those areas. I think towards Whilst we had no executive and no scrutiny committees, obviously I reconstituted the Civil Service Board and commissioned work, regular work in terms of the outcomes of those action plans, those outworkings of those were presented to this committee when it was reformed in March, again to ensure that we were addressing those. Our view of the remaining 16, that 10 of those had been delivered, but we absolutely accept that the Audit Office's perspective, if they have not been able to audit and put the controls in check to make sure that they have been in place, they do not consider that to be agreed until that's done, and we will endeavour then to move that forward.
Okay, I think more specificity on who owns the reform agenda, what the reform agenda means, would obviously be welcome, including in a final programme for government. We're bringing the Deputy Chair. We'll see members trying to get around it as quickly as possible because we have time is finite. Thank you.
Thank you, Chair. And just on this one, obviously it was a really significant inquiry, significant recommendations, and some time has passed. And then we had the COVID inquiry with a lot of the same issues rearing their head, and it didn't do very much for public confidence in the civil service here. And whenever this report came out last week, the fact that some of the headlines were that recommendations were not accepted by yourselves, that the Audit Office had made, and things weren't implemented all these years on. What do you plan to do in terms of confidence building on the back of that?
Yeah, and I acknowledge obviously there were findings that came out, and I was very clear and upfront about the findings from the inquiry and the need for reform. In further areas, and areas that we could have done and should have improved on in the context of all the issues that the service had and the difficulties and pressures and officials. I think our action plan had identified that actually some of those areas had been delivered, but I also then, looking forward, there was additional findings that I saw in terms of the COVID inquiry itself that brought us beyond what the RHI was saying. So I undertook, as you'll be aware, an independent review of some of the findings in those areas. Some of those are for ministers to decide, and they're with ministers in terms of executive minutes, etc., to consider, but also the use of digital and transformation. So I, with the Department of Finance, looked towards our forum for data management and data sharing, which was the SARO forum, the Information Governance Board, and we undertook a review of that, taking in the past recommendations, but also what we'd learned from the COVID inquiry, and then looking forward to where technology was bringing us. So that has been reconstituted. The terms of reference have been agreed by the Civil Service Board. They will be put into. I met with the Information Governor of the UK to feed into that process, to making sure we were leaning in to best practice. It is broader than the range of the RHI aspects. In the record management itself, within the Audit Office's report to the RHI, there were 3 recommendations identified. The first 2 of those recommendations in terms of delivery have been delivered in terms of their report. There was one which wasn't, which was in terms of the audit of have that actually been seen to be done, indeed the thematic audit. We had completed the thematic audit by group internal audit of raising a concern, and all those raising concern issues have been fulfilled that were identified in the RHI report. The group internal audit undertake an exercise within each department to raise any information management issues, and I've asked for them to come back to the Civil Service Board to raise any areas that are outside that in terms of governance, as well as to their accounting officers. But we will be instructing them to undertake that thematic review of those information management, which will close that 3rd area. It was felt that was better to take place once we had reconstituted the board and addressed future issues, so we weren't just monitoring the implementations of the RHI recommendations, but the further recommendations that had come out through our own internal findings in terms of that inquiry. And we understand how important it is to be scrutinised, to held account, and to build that public confidence in everything we do.
And appreciate all the detail that you've given there, but just in terms of providing that greater assurance, coming through the recommendations of that RHI inquiry, the COVID inquiry, are you confident that we're not going to be seeing the same issues reared again in another inquiry with the same findings?
Well, that's why we've put the structures in place to provide that review. We have reconstituted, we've taken significant actions to reform that board. We have identified then through the Civil Service Board, I have reconstituted that in the last number of years, and we have independent non-execs to hold us to account to those areas and to make the reform. We'll also, that will be provided as part of a recommendation to the draft programme for government, again, which will be publishing the outcomes of that as committed to annually, so that we're held to account in an external and transparent process as well.
because nobody wants to be, hearing the same things again and facing that. And finally, do you believe that the re-establishing of the subcommittee that was recommended by the Audit Office is the most effective way to provide the oversight of these the outstanding recommendations?
That would be, again, as David referenced, that the subcommittee was stood down because it had fulfilled the terms of reference for the review. I think there's a mechanism to look towards in a draft programme for government, and that will be through consultation, what will be the right way in terms of scrutinising that reform and transformation, which is broader than our RGI is really important. And I really don't want, obviously, to lessen kind of the impact in all those other areas, but there are broader issues that we need to address in terms of reform and transformation for the public sector, our skill set, the ageing demographic, all those areas that need to be factored into a broader proposition.
Thank you. Okay, thank you, Deputy Chair. I'm going to have to limit members now. We have been very generous with people through the previous section. Our witnesses have got finite time. Jerry Carroll, so if I don't want to have to limit questions, but I may have to in order to get through business.
There's two questions. The first one, Jane, is recommendation 5.1 and 5.2 hasn't been fully implemented, which is about training ministers. It's quite shocking that it hasn't been fully implemented. How confident are you the ministers are fully trained in their job? That's not a leading question. That's just an obvious point, given the fact that they haven't completed the full training.
So David can perhaps come in some of those references. So obviously we have provided substantive training and induction. In fact, as an executive, one of the first things we did for executive ministers was brief in terms of the civil contingencies aspect and the need in terms of the awareness of those areas. There is further advice that has been prepared to go to ministers for consideration in terms of guidance for them and their executive office, which would reflect some of those areas that it will be for ministers to decide in that provision. I think some of the areas that were identified in the Audit Office's report were for ministers and also for special advisors, and we have provided training material, and I think it references that 9 out of 11 special advisors have taken up that training. At the moment it is optional, and it of course is not for me to mandate what ministers or indeed and their officials are under that basis. The request from the Audit Office and what they've identified is they do not want that to be optional. That will be to be mandatory, and that will again, we will provide advice, but that will be for ministers rightly to conclude on all those decisions. David, is there anything
Can I
else
just move on? Just conscious of time. Thanks for that. Just another question is number 39. Sorry I could have called you, David, but maybe in writing if possible. Number 39 hasn't been implemented, which is ministers should read and familiarise themselves with legislation. It just sounds bonkers. It hasn't been fully implemented. Why? An obvious question. And who would ensure that ministers commit to number 39? Would it be yourself, Jane?
I'll go through that then
Sure.
David will come in with the technical. I guess the feedback was obviously in terms of drafting any kind of legislative policy, there is consultation, there is development, there's evidence and rigour provided for that. It's then brought, which is led by the Minister, it's then brought into the Executive. Again, there'll be information challenge to that and then the scrutiny process itself. So we couldn't identify what mechanism you would prove that someone had actually read it, and we worked with the Northern Ireland Office and they couldn't actually provide an inference to say how we could satisfy that beyond the broad areas. But David?
Yeah, I think the important thing here is it's not that it isn't happening, it's whether or not you can prove that it's happening. And it's actually not so much an audit process to demonstrate that a minister knows the legislation or the policy that they're introducing. Rather, that's part of the scrutiny function of the Assembly. So to provide an action or a process that's introduced new as a threshold for ministers to demonstrate, I'm not sure that works if it's civil servants doing that. Rather, that's the Assembly's function. So I don't think the conclusion is that it's not happening.
I think we're going to move on if that's okay, Jack. But there is a reasonable, I think on this one there is a reasonable argument that it's ministers' jobs to read it's right that they do it, but the ministers, and it's our job to hold them to account for it. But Paul Frew,
part of that recommendation 38 is also
people can be as brief and answer questions and brief and answers to be our time.
Is also to ensure an adequate evidence base is publicly available to demonstrate that the benefits justify any attendant costs. I think we've seen this week that has not been the case on RHI regulations. So that's the point I'll make there. Jane, you said at the very start that you were accepting of the Audit Officer's report. The Audit Office report is very clear. There are 5 areas, 5 recommendations, which they say that the planned action from the Department and the Civil Service is unlikely to fully address the recommendations. So what actions are you and the Department of Finance taking to remedy the Audit Officer's findings?
Yes, and also to reflect on the Audit Officer's report, previously they had a larger number which were unlikely, and those are now moved into likely and indeed achieved, so that is a moving trajectory. There is 5 that were identified as unlikely. The scrutiny perspective, they have not been able to identify how we would verify that. Again, it's for ministers to decide, but we are endeavouring to identify what a mechanism would be which would fulfil to the satisfaction of the Audit Office, acknowledging that the scrutiny function is provided by ministers. The project board, which was recommendation 13, that is provided under the Dear Accounting Officer level. That's about having that professional expertise, and 05/23 that was updated and is provided in that substance. Their request is that there's an audit from CPD to perform that. That will now take over audit. It's not saying that it isn't exactly the expertise, it's actually it isn't audited, so we're exploring how that can be fulfilled. The third recommendation, 9.2, was that training for commercial expertise. There are a very significant range of training and commercial expertise which has been provided. There is CPD training, there is work with the Cabinet Office training, there is e-learning training, so that is also being provided. The Audit Office's recommendation was that should be delivered at a senior management level. She defined that. The views that we were defining was that that's a line manager's perspective because they know better who is provided, but they want to see that as senior management, so that is an area that we can potentially address. There were, in terms of the governance areas, and again that was 32A, we acknowledge there is further work that needs to be done on that, and we are endeavoured to deliver that. The 18.2, that was the audit of the record keeping, which we talked about before, that to have a thematic audit going across the record keeping. They acknowledged that of the record keeping requirements, 2 of them have been delivered, which was the substance of the ministerial meetings and the advice that is there provided, but there wasn't an audit that they could prove that had happened, and that's the area that we're going to undertake. I clarified then that there is audits taking place, and record management is a standard part of group internal audit, which is raised and
Can I interrupt you there? So you say that that's happening with regards to audit and information gathering, but the actual Audit Office report was delayed because the Department of Finance couldn't provide the material which the Department of Finance used to publish their March 2024 report, which should have been readily available because it was only published months before.
I'll come in on that. Doing 2 slightly different things that David can speak to. We collect a lot of data from other departments, some of which is relevant, some of it is certainly ours, but we simply don't have the resource within our audit teams. We're running huge numbers of vacancies. We have a limited audit service. It takes us a bit longer to collate all of the information in the way that the Audit Office, when you're doing an audit, you need a different set of evidence than we would have to provide an update to the committee of how we're making progress. So collecting slightly different things, but I absolutely respect that recommendation. It did take us a little bit of time, and that is absolutely down to the resourcing constraints that we have in the department.
And I'll end it here, Chair, with this last point. Paragraph 30 of the audit report, we conclude that the overall pace of implementation has been slow. In only 2 of the 7 themes have any recommendations been fully addressed. These findings are concerning, particularly given the significance of the inquiry's findings, the degree of public interest and the need for the Northern Ireland Civil Service to restore public confidence by demonstrating that the relevant lessons have been learned. That's the end piece of this audit report. Jane, what do you say to that?
I absolutely appreciate those areas. Of course, we would have wished there was further progress. Some of them that have been, is raised a concern, has been fully completed. There is a strong thematic area through the ones that haven't been, either they're deemed as likely or have not yet completed, is actually the audit function that we can provide confidence to the Audit Office that actually the actions plans which we have delivered have actually been given to effect. So we're really clear what needs to be done in terms of that, and give commitment to progress and deliver on those aspects.
Okay, I'll leave it there.
Okay, there are lots more to discuss this. It is concerning, the resource constraints in the Department of Finance's audit. I'm sure you would say that yourself, but I mean, that is pretty chilling if this can't be done. Nicola Brogan, and then we'll go to Philip Brett, and then we'll be close to wrapping up. Nicola?
Thanks, Chair. Just following on from Paul's question there, did the Assembly being down, did that have an effect on how quickly these recommendations could have been implemented, or could the Department still have carried through that without having ministers in place?
It's a mix, really, Nicola. There's some things we can progress and have done. Obviously, without an assembly, there are different pressures and that come to officials, so you also have an additional resource constraint. But there are some clearly would require ministerial decision making. So, if elected officials couldn't take action to resolve some of those, you'll also have heard in many things we've progressed into a broader programme of work. Information Saro Forum would be one example, or People Plan, or the policy work to try and take things forward within the resource constraints that we have. But obviously, with an executive not in place or any other extenuating circumstances, that does impact the pace. So some we can do and progress, some a little bit slower.
And I guess just on that point, of the ones that did refer to ministers and special advisors, there were 10. 5 have been delivered. 4 are likely to be delivered. And again, I talked about that advice. And the one that referred to is that scrutiny function. We are actively identifying to see how we can do that. I guess just to give to give members confidence, during the 2-year period when we didn't have the scrutiny committees, we continued to commission the work. That work was not provided as part of an incoming executive. That was work that we commissioned for the Civil Service Board so that we could scrutinise that and make sure that we were delivering that project as part of the reform. But obviously some of these recommendations can only be given effect through ministerial and indeed executive approval.
Thank you for that. Just quickly, back to the point you were discussing with Jerry about the training that was developed. So special advisors, I think you said 9 out of 11 of those have taken up training, and ministers taken other kind of training. Is there training developed as well for other members of staff?
Absolutely. So in terms of the record management, there is a compulsory e-learning package that's, I think, rolling out next
4th of November.
The 4th of November, which will be compulsory for all staff. That isn't required actually to fulfil the recommendations of the RHI, but came out of the work that we did in the Saro Forum after COVID inquiry and the immediate actions that we wanted to put in place as well. There are further rollouts of indeed those areas too. The professionalisation, we cover those which are covered for the RHI, but it's a broader suite and in terms of our strategy. Do you want to?
I was just going to say, in respect of the training for ministers and special advisors, conversely, there is an ongoing available work for civil servants in working with ministers and briefing to private offices. So as it were, the other side of the table is also being briefed in the same terms to understand the same requirements.
Okay.
Okay.
Thanks, Chair.
And then finally, Philip Brett.
Thank you, Chair. Thank you again for your presentation so far. So, obviously, New Decade, New Approach committed the executive parties to close the RHI scheme, and that's the continued position of the executive. As head of the civil service chain, do you have a role in trying to bring that around?
That would be a decision for the executive ministers. My position, clearly as all officials are, is to provide advice.
Yes. You have been providing that advice then on an ongoing basis to help close the scheme?
The provision of RHI and closing that scheme would be a matter for the Minister of the Economy and not party to me. I do not direct.
No, you don't direct, but you help advise.
I have not provided advice. I have not provided advice.
At any stage since 2020 to now? 0.
In terms of closing off a scheme which is in the policy direction of the Minister, no, it would be not my position to obviously the accountability for Department of Economy is from the accounting officer of that. And then
you attend executive meetings though, correct?
I do, yes.
Yeah. Would you be aware then of what executive papers make it onto the agenda and what executive papers don't make it onto the agenda?
As secretary of the executive, I would of course be furnished with the executive papers.
Yeah. And what also ones then for, say, a minister wanted on the executive agenda but it wasn't agreed by other parties to go on to, that you'd be aware of that?
I would be a secretary of the executive, yes.
Okay. And during that period from 2020 until now, are you aware of any attempts to put papers onto the executive for closure of the scheme that wasn't agreed to go on to the agenda?
I can't comment on that at the moment. I'm not aware of the schedule of the papers.
Did you check? The reason I ask is just the Economy Minister on Monday in the Chamber to me said that your party had 2 or 3 economy ministers in the previous executive and did not take any steps to bring this scheme to a close. My colleague Diane Dodds and Gordon Lyons tried to put executive papers on the agenda to close the scheme and were blocked by Sinn Féin. So just as Secretary then, could you provide the committee then with details of when those papers were submitted and weren't agreed to go on by Sinn Féin?
Well, obviously, happy to take advice. I'm not sure what forum that comes through, whether that's a...
I think it would be helpful to understand if any papers were provided, but obviously the members also chair of the Economy Committee and he has other routes to ask that question, but I think it would be helpful for us to factually have that information, but it's not primarily the responsibility of this Scrutiny Committee, but the member has put his views on the record. Okay, just on the subject of, on the broader question of civil service propriety and civil service reform, I did want to raise again, since it's the first time we've had yourself, G, in front of us since the monitoring round and subsequent election, I wanted to raise that with you, and I've had correspondence from you for which I'm grateful, and I've shared for the purposes of transparency with my committee colleagues. Can I just ask, I suppose, I know you need to get away, so I will be brief. From your perspective, what is the purpose of pre-election guidance?
Pre-election guidance is provided to, obviously, officials in departments to, I guess, twofold, is to ensure that officials aren't used in terms of anything that would give effect for election in terms of putting in mind their impartiality, and secondly, into ensuring that the function of government isn't used to promote or cut across any party political activity.
Indeed, and that largely resonates with what's in the pre-election guidance ahead of the general election. It says civil servants should ensure that public resources are not used for party political purposes. Anything that could cause political impartiality could be questioned. It also says departments should, as far as possible, avoid competition with candidates for the attention of the public. So I just wanted to show you a couple of items of public communication that happened in the immediate aftermath of the monitoring round. This is a tweet from the First Minister with an infographic on it which says £300 million for public services. It says today the Executive has approved a £300 million investment in education and public services. That was the 1st of July. It has a Sinn Féin infographic. There's also a news story from the BBC Online which says Stormont agrees at it says Health Department gets £122 million in Stormont mini budget. I suppose I'm interested in your opinion as to whether these tweets, you would call them party political purposes.
It's not my perspective. It's not my position to critique ministers in their office. I work for ministers under their direction and control. The advice that was provided was clear in terms of those areas, but also clear in terms of the areas of normal business should continue. So
I'm not asking you to critique ministers. I'm asking, I suppose, first of all, I'm asking you to give your opinion on whether a tweet from the First Minister with an infographic from her party 3 days from a general election would be a reasonable person might describe as a party political purpose.
It is not my perspective to have a view on that. I don't have an opinion on that. You
don't have an opinion on whether an infographic with £300 million for public services is party political purposes. That's fine. You put that on the record. Personally, I think it's fairly transparently for party political purposes. It is true to say, is it not, that you do have responsibility for upholding the impartiality and integrity of the civil service. And as you've said, the election guidance is very specific that civil servants should ensure that public resources are not used for party political purposes, and departments should avoid as far as possible competition with candidates for the attention of the public. Do you think that a monitoring round in which the headline of the BBC News website in Northern Ireland is Stormont mini budget is competing with candidates?
It's not, in the terms of the monitoring round, which I'm happy to address, obviously there was 2 particular areas that were happening at that stage. One was the draft programme for government, and I gave advice that could not proceed, and I know members maybe had different views on that, because that was a position, in my view, which would, and I have just been engaged in consultation draft programme for government, that would engage officials in terms of delivery. The monitoring round, which I think you're referring to, Chair, is in terms of was published as a perspective in advance of the election being caused. in the areas, and understand, obviously, and I think I've been in front of this committee when we were discussing this as well.
That was before the election, though. That was before the monitoring round.
That my finance colleague will be able to provide further reflections on, is that there were two areas that we had in terms of our pressures within our budget, and a failure to declare those monitoring rounds could have led for a provision for either departments not thinking that they were going to avail of that funding, or indeed making cuts which would need to be provided as part of that funding package. Such were the pressures, and I understand that all other obviously other devolved administrations were not in line with the pressures that we were perceiving.
To be clear, and for the purposes of the record, anyone who's watching, we would have been talking about a delay of 4 days. The difference between doing it on a Monday and doing it on a Friday, which would have been out with the election time. So the position in relation to unbearable spending pressures.
Just to confirm that the advice that I provided to departments was it was just after the provision of the announcement in terms of the general election. That advice was provided to departments, so it is not my view. It is not obviously me to be provision of when announcements are made or those other areas.
Do you think the June monitoring round should have gone ahead when it did?
I think the June monitoring round was in line with the pressures, the normal running of business.
Do you think, based on everything you know now, including the content that I've put forward to you today, it was a good idea and it was in line with the spirit of the guidance for the June monitoring round to go ahead?
I think it was in line with the provisions, and again, the Department of Finance can speak to their own.
It was in line with the pre-election, pre-election guidance.
It was in line with the pre-election guidance in terms of the normal running of business. It was provided in advance. There were significant pressures in Department. The risk of not.
These aren't party political purposes. This isn't competing with candidates.
And again, I'm not here to arbitrate over the PR or comms activity or individual political parties. I'm here to represent the service.
Okay, I think I've established your position on it. Implausible, I'm afraid, though I find it. Just one point for yourself, Neil, is in relation to a previous letter that I had from the head of the Civil Service in relation to the June monitoring announcement, specified that the timescale was in line with one of the reasons given for doing it when it was done was the 24-25 in-year monitoring of public expenditure guidelines, a document which I have in front of me, which outlines that that it should happen by the date that it did happen by. Okay, but it also outlines that the October monitoring round, there should have been an executive meeting on that tomorrow, and there should be an assembly statement by next Monday. I presume those aren't going to happen.
No, that's correct. Context is important here. I spoke to the committee before about the decisions and the advice that I provided back in June. It keeps me awake every night, the scale of overcommitment that we have, hundreds of millions. So getting clarity to an advice up as quickly as I can remains my absolute gold standard to which I hold myself to. That same advice and approach was taken in this particular round, October monitoring carrying out as normal. However, in a very unusual step, we then got clarity that the budget on the 30th will provide clarity on exactly what Barnett consequentials we're going to have. Now, we're not talking, that could be a quantum of significant millions. To then provide, which we did, advice as to how to allocate as much money as we have available, knowing that we'll have clarity of how much that quantum is. So my overriding advice always is, as soon as we can provide clarity and advice on that clarity of what quantum of money is available, we will do it.
To be clear, I have absolutely no difficulty with the department delaying the October monitoring round for until after the UK budget. I think that's sensible. But what I do think is that it is implausible to say that it couldn't have been delayed for a few days in June, July, and I have put those points on the record. But I think given the conversation we've just had about the seriousness of public opinion in relation to post-RHI, the credibility of the civil service and the credibility of Stormont, it is frankly shocking what happened in June has not been, that it was allowed to happen, and we still don't have any serious consideration of what an alternative might have looked like. But I put those points on the record. Deputy Chair.
Thank you, Chair. Just speaking, Neil had spoke there to the hundreds of millions of pounds of overcommitments in year. Back in June, in the monthly outturn reports, it was well in excess of 800 million that was reported into the Finance Minister. That was the estimated overcommitment, so much so that she commenced a urgent exercise to see what it was, and that actually brought the report of the figure in August down to £769 million in terms of actual overcommitments. And we've got our outturn figures coming through from September, and they're up to £813 million. Has something happened for this to increase by £44 million in the month, or have we got an overinflation of figures coming through from our departmental returns?
No, I can give you more detail on that, but essentially it's just slightly measuring two different things. In that 830 figure you quote, there is a number there of expected into transfers, health migration schemes. There are some other monies that we know, but because they're not confirmed, they're not reported in that overcommitment. So that six, although it changes day by day, but that 767 still remains roughly about the figure that we expect once those transfers come through. I'll give you more detail to the committee just to clarify that difference, but it isn't a substantial inflation from that point. It's just there are different items included in that 830 figure that aren't in the 767.
Thank you. Just whenever there was the urgent intervention by the Minister and the specific exercise, I wasn't expecting to see a movement, in the following month's returns coming through. And just one further question to Jane. In terms of the pursuing the higher standard of policy making across the civil service, have you any plans or initiatives ongoing for greater coordination with the Home Civil Service?
Yes, so we have, as I mentioned, some substantive engagement with the Home Civil Service. I attend Wednesday morning colleagues, which is led by Simon Case, and I would attend Whitehall, again engagement also with the service in the Republic of Ireland. There is a policy group, and indeed, I'm just referring to the recommendations 1, 1, 1, 1, 2 and 2 and 2 and 4 of the 5 recommendations in the RHI requirement, or the RHI recommendations are covered in that the Making a Difference policy, which is led by our head of policy, Dennis McMahon, and that will give effect to those areas. And again, there's been engagement with UK civil service in terms of that regard. I think the areas that we're looking at for the reform and transformation and building in those areas of expertise will be important as we deliver that reform. Our CSA, our CSTA, who's been appointed, up until this point in Northern Ireland, we have never had a person sitting on that broader kind of panel with those experts across the UK government. So she is now embedded in that approach, and as we see the industrial strategy leading, that will include policy development, but more broadly kind of that strategic areas. So I think it's east, west, north, south and international are areas that we're seeking to look towards. Again, the outcomes framework that have been defined are Carnegie based, and we've had engagement with Carnegie as part of that to look towards the international areas of embedding best practice. Thanks, Chair.
Okay, a reminder. Sorry, David, did you just come in?
I was just going to add around the development of the policy function, policy skills in the civil service. The policy community within the Northern Ireland Civil Service is a full member of a wider civil service policy community, which really is kind of a professional connection. And so we have connections right into the policy profession unit, which actually works out of DEFRA in Whitehall. And we have access to a lot of their materials and their events, and we then also contribute to their understanding of the specifics of policy making in our context. So it's very professionally very, very closely connected.
What's amazing is the remarkable similarities, talking to colleagues in other jurisdictions, of the problems we face, workload of staff, pay conditions, morale, public confidence, all of the things that we've talked about are some that we've talked about today. So there's a lot of commonality in the issues being faced.
Okay, we'll try and get around briefly to get Jerry.
Thanks. Quickly, approximately, Jane and your team, how many meetings have you had with the Treasury officials and NIO since the formation of the executive? Approximate figure?
So there'll be obviously, I would have not that much engagement with Treasury, as you might imagine. My engagement has been through Treasury, through the PermSec in terms of the broader session, so I'm sure Neil can provide some flavour of those.
Yes, I mean it's almost a daily and weekly engagement with Treasury around a whole raft of matters, some that we've discussed today, but I mean that's an almost daily engagement.
I appreciate that. And you said earlier on, Jane, about putting more money in people's pockets. I mean obviously it's music to my ears, given my political perspective. I mean in those meetings, yourself and Neil, has anybody been talking about the need for corporation tax to be raised, to be increased, to look at new ways of raising finance through wealth taxes, or is that considered sort of off limits?
Is this in the Wednesday? Are you talking about in the PermSec meetings?
General meetings with Treasury, NAO.
I think that's
well,
quite a broad question, but
yeah,
feel free to
I
answer
can pick
it.
up with that. We do discuss a range of matters, but certainly in terms of no specifics around corporation tax have been discussed. Particularly at the moment, it's really been a very particular focus on block grant, Barnett consequentials, exactly what our funding position is. So no, there's been no specific, not in recent times.
Or wealth
I guess
taxes.
just to clarify, there'd be no discussions that we would have either, in my experience in civil service, backdoor conversations with any officials outside without ministerial approval of the approach. Obviously,
No, that's fair enough. I'm just curious, and I just like final point is like I think it's curious and some ways unusual. I mean, given the fact that last week we heard that Moy Park is now making £2 billion in income, so we've got potentially the richest company ever in the north and no extra taxes. But I just make that point.
I think in fairness, Jerry, yeah, we are, because we're really we are pushing through the time barriers that the witnesses have given us. So very briefly, Philip Brett and then Nicola finally.
Thank you, Chair. I just wanted to raise the issue
Deirdre, sorry, it's Deirdre, not go ahead.
that we had the head of the civil service here in relation to the civil service inclusive language guide that was produced just last month. Whose purview does that fall under? Yours, Jane, as head of the civil service department?
Mine under the personnel and our role there in HR matters.
No, I just think it's vital that no one in our civil service is discriminated or felt to be discriminated against on the basis of their sex, religion, sexual orientation, or anything like that. But what does this document find so offensive about the term mum or dad?
We engage fully with all of our staff groups. You rightly said in your introduction there exactly what sort of service that we wish to run. It's provided a guidance to allow people to look up, refer to, if they run into a situation where any language that they have used has been uncomfortable or unsettling for any member of the team.
Okay, so it's just this document's obviously been sent to employees and it says instead of using the word mum or dad or instead of using the word husband or wife, do you not think, Neil, that that's slightly aggressive or exaggerated behaviour, or from the department that people shouldn't use terms such as mum or dad or husband or wife?
I don't personally, but that's only because I think the guidance is there. Guidance as it is, that people should feel in any employment that they can feel safe to correct someone if they use a term or a phrase that doesn't sit comfortably with them or doesn't adequately describe their situation. So no, I don't take the same inference from that.
And the term, so some of these terms are new to me, so apologies. The term mucks, what does that mean?
You're stretching my level of knowledge too, so...
It's just that this is in the document, obviously, that you have ownership of, and it's been sent to your civil servants. So it just says, don't use the term miss, use the term mucks, MX, or pronounced as MUX. So the point that I'm going to make is that at the start of this, it's vital that all civil servants are treated with respect, or treated based on regardless of their religion, regardless of their sexual orientation. But I would advise you to have a look at this document, because some of it is very excessive, Neil. And also, Stonewall are on the front of this, and organisations such as the Equality and Human Rights Commission, BBC, Sport England, etc. have pulled out of associating with that organisation. So I just encourage you as a department to look at your relationships with that organisation also.
Okay, Julie Hargy.
It's just as opposed to restate my view on the due monitoring round. I think it was the right thing to do because of the pressures at that time. And I suppose just to point out, Chair, I know you made reference to some communication with regard to this issue, but I think it would be important just to determine if that's communication that was sent to you in your capacity as opposition leader or as chair of this committee. So just to make sure that we have that differentiation during these meetings.
I think I obviously am both chair of the Finance Committee and I'm also a serving MLA and a leader of the opposition. We all have political roles, and I give everybody in this committee, including yourself, ample opportunity to make political points in addition to technical finance committee points.
I think just when letters, it's only in the context of you saying there's letters, so that we know if it's a letter that we have received or not, or if it's just been you receiving it as chair.
Share the letter.
Or, so it's just for clarification.
Just
if
to
that
be aware,
can
I
be
have
given.
I have shared that. I'm happy to share any other, but the letter that I referred to was shared with members of the committee and is in your pack today. Should anybody wish to read it? But that is a fair point, and I think so. That's a reasonable point, but it is in the members' packs. If anybody else wishes to come in, I think at this point I will mercifully say to our witnesses, thank you very much for staying longer than you were intended to. You probably won't want to rush back, but you've given.
I think I'm most
but there are obviously serious matters we needed to discuss and put on the record. We will look forward to following up. We will follow up with your office and indeed with the DALO on specific points. There are issues of concern, but it was helpful to get some of those points on the record. Thank you very much for your time, Jane, Neil, David and Aidan. Thank you.
I guess can I just conclude to say how welcome I find the feedback from this, and I know it is robust and everything else, but if we are to reform and transform, it is so helpful to get this, and this is why I am offering to go to PAC committees as opposed to being called to them, and I think it's important that we have collective perspectives. We're trying to break down silos that we're representing, even if it is outside the strict governance structures of that as well. So I'm very grateful for everyone.
I'm glad, and I hope people in the committee will understand that our job is to be respectful but robust, and to do our jobs on any committee of this assembly. We're here to be robust but respectful, and we wouldn't be doing our jobs if we weren't. Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Okay, members, I have now so long and detailed as that. I have lost my speaking note.
We're top of page 17.
We are indeed. Okay, so in terms of follow-up actions,
we have a number of pieces of information we will now seek. Anything where anyone said they might or could or would think about providing it, we have record of that, and we will proceed with asking for all of that information.
Yep.
And we'll come back to committee when we get responses.
Okay, thank you very much, Clark. Philip, do you want to come in?
I just probably was, but just for clarity, do we ensure that we do follow up to see which departments missed the deadline of last Friday for resubmitted bids to the Department of Finance, and what possible impact that may or may not have on decision making missing a deadline? And also, given that some other departments made their deadline, and had they known that a deadline was very flexible, and what unfair impact that may or may not have had in their quality of submission.
Indeed, I also think it's worth making sure we get the 9th of September letter, which we apparently are fully entitled to, but we haven't had thus far. Okay, if members are happy enough, we will move on to a further oral briefing. We are a little bit behind our indicative time, but obviously it's a very important evidence session. They're coming in via Zoom, yes, okay. So, members, this obviously, I hope members are content that Hansard report this briefing. Members, we agreed to schedule this update briefing to monitor progress towards introduction of the bill, and this is an opportunity to explore the timeline for the legislation. The meeting pack at page 652 includes a clerk's memo relating to this item. Additional papers have been provided for this session and include information which was requested following a briefing from officials in April this year, which details the potential sanctions, tariffs and enforcement of the minimum age of marriage in a future bill. That is at page 628 of the meeting pack. A departmental briefing paper for today's session, which can be found, so that's the page 628 of the main meeting pack, and then the departmental briefing paper is at page 113 of the tabled pack. So we have joining us via Zoom Michael Foster, who's Head of Civil Law Reform at the Department of Finance, and Martin Tyrrell, who is Policy Advisor in the same team. Welcome to you both. Michael or Martin, do you want to give us a really brief update on where this legislation is, please?
Sure. I don't propose to overly rehearse the paper we've sent to you. We spoke to you last in April and outlined the general policy proposals. Since then, Chair, the Minister agreed to take a paper to the Executive asking her ministerial colleagues to agree the policy. Members will recall that the proposal centred around two main areas, those being to bring the leaf marriage within the statutory framework, and then also to raise the minimum age of marriage and civil partnership from 16 to 18. And that paper also sought approval to begin drafting on a bill. That paper Chair, was circulated for comment to ministers back in May, and we had hoped that that paper would have been considered at the executive before the summer. But perhaps due to the general election and other factors, the paper didn't make the agenda until the 26th of September. But it has subsequently been agreed by the executive. So I'm pleased to update members that the Office of Legislative Counsel have received full instructions on the bill. We have been in touch with the draftsperson, and drafting is now underway. We hope that that will be completed in the first part of 2025, with the bill being introduced when it's ready for that stage. I don't propose really to take up too much more time in terms of an opening statement, Chair. I'm happy if you want to proceed to questions.
Thank you very much, Michael. That is admirably brief. Gold star, definite Christmas card from the Finance Committee on that. And I think
Christmas email, Chairman.
Christmas email. Yes, we are the Finance Committee after all. Caesar's wife, etc., etc. We will need to be okay. So, if instructions have gone to Council and it's being drafted now, with you hope by early 2025, is the broad intention to introduce this bill before summer recess 2025?
Well, that's our hope, Chair. At the moment, the bill is actually a Year 2 bill, which would technically make it a 2025-26 session bill. But we are hopeful, and having spoken to OLC about this, we would be hopeful that a bill will be ready for introduction before the summer.
Okay. Relatively open question, but the committee we have a very busy schedule, but were there availability in any of our evidence sessions? Who do you think, as the lead officials, we should be listening to in terms of pre-legislative scrutiny?
Well, I think it would be right for the committee to take cognizance of those who responded to the committees or for the departmental consultation. So, for example, some of the church groups may well have an interest in this. There are belief bodies who will doubtlessly wish to provide some evidence to you, including the humanist bodies. On the age of marriage side, some of the NGOs locally have a very keen interest in this, such as the Children's Commissioner, the Human Rights Commission, and other such bodies have expressed a keen interest in the age of marriage proposals. Those would be the main types of bodies, but I'm more than happy to liaise with the committee in terms of the broader tranche of people and bodies who give very constructive evidence to the consultation when we conducted it.
Okay, and just on a separate but related point within your bit of the department, can you remind us where we are in terms of a report on the operation of the Defamation Act?
So on the Defamation Act, the report was published. It was led at the Assembly. Martin will correct me if I'm wrong, but I think it was led at the Assembly in June in order to meet the statutory deadline. So that report has been circulated to all of those who participated in the private members bill that you'll recall, Chair, during the last mandate. And at the moment, we're essentially keeping a watching brief on things and keeping an eye on developments elsewhere.
And I think one of the main thrusts of that report is it's slightly too early to tell.
Yeah, that's right. The legislation has been in force now for just over 2 years. And given the very nature of defamation cases, it does take some time for those to filter through. So it's difficult to gauge with any degree of certainty how the Defamation Act 2022 has landed in practical terms. Although we did get a small sense of that during the work we did on the report, but we won't really have a clear idea of that for maybe a year, 2 years, maybe even longer.
Okay, and then finally we got a briefing last week from Professor Latu and her colleague about the research that had gone in terms of gender recognition and possible reform of gender recognition certificates. Is that an active work programme, or is that sort of research just kind of effectively sitting in the department awaiting a policy intention?
I wouldn't go so far as to say that it's just sitting in the department, nor is this an area that is top of our list of current work load. But that said, it is very much an area that we're keeping a watching brief on. The key driver, I think, in terms of policy development for us is that we have a new Labour government in place who have expressed a different view of gender recognition reform than the previous Conservative government. I met with colleagues in the relevant English department last month.
Just to double check, which department is that? Is that Health or Justice?
No, it's the Government Equalities Office, a part of the Cabinet Office.
Okay.
So that team there are, well, understandably, because ministers there are relatively new in post, they're still probing with their ministers as to the nature and scale of what the policy development looks like there. In the Labour manifesto, there's a very clear outline given that they wanted to modernise and simplify and make less intrusive the gender recognition process. So we're liaising with colleagues in England and Wales to see how that will manifest itself into concrete policy proposals. And from then, we'll obviously provide further advice to the Minister on the point.
Okay. That's good. Thank you. I'm going to bring in colleagues now. Deputy Chair, Diane Shea.
Thank you, Chair, and thanks, Michael and Martin, for joining us again today. I wanted to ask, what engagement has the department had with churches and faith-based organisations around the proposal to raise the minimum age of marriage since the Minister has assumed office?
Well, we haven't had any additional meetings with the churches. The Minister met on the request of the Humanists, the Northern Ireland Humanist Body, met with the humanist organisations. We got a sense from the churches during the consultation process that they understood and were relatively comfortable with the idea of raising the minimum age of marriage from 16 to 18. Martin can maybe come in and give specific examples of the main churches who responded to that consultation.
We had responses from Church of Ireland, Catholic Church and Presbyterian Church. Catholic Church and the Church of Ireland were both supportive of increasing the minimum age to 18. From memory, I think the Presbyterian Church had some reservations, which had to do with the fact that the proposed minimum age was now higher than the age of consent. But the other two churches were supportive.
Thank you. And would any final bill reflect in practice some of the concerns raised around creating the disparity between the age of consent and the age of marriage in the context of religious belief and freedom?
No, I think it's a simple answer to that. We've conducted a very careful analysis of the various arguments raised during the consultation, and the fact that 97% of consultees were in favour of raising the age to 18, and that is very much in line with the direction of travel in terms of international best practice and also in terms of developments on these islands, where both England and Wales have raised the minimum age to 18 quite recently, as have the South. I think the view very much within the department, which the Minister shares, is that it is the right thing to do, is to raise it from 16 to 18.
Okay. Just one brief point, like on the why, what is the root of the, is it a belief that the age of consent should be the same as the age of marriage on a kind of for a principled reason, or is there, it's just intrigued to understand what the rationale is there?
I don't think that any of the consultees during the process were advocating that we look again at the age of consent with a view to raising it. But obviously there was reservations expressed there, and I think it's probably, without it being specified, a situation where by maybe a pregnancy occurs in teenage years, and there might be some reference that that would be undertaken in a married context, but those types of arguments were very much outweighed by the counter arguments in terms of some of the concerns raised by consultees in relation to marrying at 16 and 17 years of age.
Okay, that's useful. The next person is Jerry Carroll.
Thank you. Just a quick comment, Chair. In terms of gender certificates and gender recognition, we had a really excellent presentation last week, and I'm sure you've paid attention to it. But basically talking through the problems and the difficulties and barriers faced by the trans community, and the difficulties and slowness of the current system, and also the fact that there's a self-ID system in the south of Ireland, and lo and behold, the sky hasn't fallen in. So yeah, just to put it on record, I think it was very useful, and hopefully that forms part of the Minister's thinking in terms of any changes in terms of hopefully a self-ID system.
Okay. Who's points on the record if anybody else wishes to come in? Nope. Okay. If not, thank you, Michael and Martin. That's really helpful. We appreciate you coming and giving us an update, and obviously, particularly on the we hope to see that draft bill sooner rather than later, and on the other points, whether it's defamation, gender recognition, or other civil law matters. We appreciate your small team that does really important work, and so thank you.
Thank you, Chair.
Cheers. Okay. Committee, the next agenda item is the outturn and forecast, outturn written briefing, September position. This is partly an innovation on our committee, to which the Deputy Chair has been very diligent in us pursuing, I think quite rightly. This is a monthly item on our agenda. This month's briefing covers September public expenditure, outturn and forecast information. That does also mean, by the way, the Deputy Chair is to blame if we're kept here. Is forecast outturn for departments. Expenditure categories are reported against non-ring-fenced resource DEL, ring-fenced DEL, capital DEL, and ring-fenced capital transactions. Ring-fenced financial transactions capital. Detailed figures for expenditure begin at page 123 of the tabled pack. At page 146 of the tabled pack, members will find detail on departmental actions to address over-commitments. And at page 152 of the tabled pack, members will find explanations for variances between August and September outturn and forecast outturn. So the department has also provided a full response on the student loan underspend, which has arisen as a result of the funding methodology. That's the thing where we get a barned consequential based on student loans in England are bigger because fees are bigger. We get a barned consequential, which is kind of a bit of an accountancy thing rather than an actual underspend. So members, obviously any member who wishes to come in, they can. Otherwise, we'll seek agreement. I think it is really important that we have this as a monthly item, and because it's useful for us to, and it keeps it in our mind, so we're not just returning when we return to monitoring rounds. Yep. that we have all this information in our heads. Okay, people are happy enough. We will share the forecast outturn with other statutory committees and the Assembly Audit Committee. People are content. Thank you. Grand. Thanks, everybody. We're back on schedule. Agenda item 9 is correspondence. The first two items of correspondence from last week's meeting, which are simply for noting. First is from the Committee for Communities, which is page 765, and it states in this correspondence that the committee has written to all departments to ask for information in relation to work and projects ongoing which involve engagement with disability fora and their members. This was following a briefing from Disability Action. The next agenda item is from the NI Authority for Utility Regulation, its annual report and accounts. It's at page 767, and there on the laid in the Assembly. Notable is that the statement of excesses will be brought to the Assembly to seek money for additional cash of 464,000 to be funded by new supply in the next Budget Act, chiefly due to delayed payment of an invoice by an electricity supplier. Okay, the next correspondence item is Budget 2025 and future years information gathering exercise. At page 888 of the pack, members, the department has informed us that a Budget 25-26 and future year, which I hope is indicative of an intention to, or a possibility of multi-year budget, information gathering exercise was commissioned on the 22nd of August with returns due by Friday the 4th of October. This exercise is due to help inform executive decisions once the funding envelope for 25-26 is announced by the Chancellor on the 30th of October. Details of DOF bids sought, including those linked to PFG commitments have been outlined at page 893 and 894 of the pack. It will be for the executive to consider the bids alongside those from other departments. So there's other stuff in there in relation to the domestic rate revaluation 2030 at page 890, and also some other information in there from the department on transformation projects, which we obviously touched on. Clark wanted to come in.
Chair, I think that's probably the first time we've had information specifically putting an indicative date on the domestic rate revaluation. So it was particularly just to draw that to members' attention and potentially, although I haven't indicated to you, Chair, maybe seek a further briefing then on how that will look.
In relation to revaluation?
Yeah.
Well, it brings me on to a point, which is it is a if there is going to be a revaluation, I both as a constituency MLA and also in my capacity as chair of the Finance Committee have had and do have occasionally business groups, as I'm sure others do, come to them with broad issues of concern about valuation levels in their area. One of them, for example, is in myself and Deirdre's constituency, the Lisburn Road Traders, and they have put together a package. So, I mean, one thing I think would be useful is if we can find out more information about when that revaluation is happening, and give information to those types of people. I'm not saying us as representatives. I'm not trying to get saying the clerk should be corresponding with every single traders group, but I have had increasing numbers of people ask me those questions.
Chair, because we're aware the business, the non-domestic rates is revalued on a 3-year cycle. That's in legislation. There's nothing equivalent for domestic rates. So business non-domestic rate reval, the latest one will be coming into effect 2026. Members might recall previously when we talked about the domestic rate, officials had indicated the sort of timescale they expected, so that it would take. So it is kind of a 3-year process. So they talked about if you started in 2025, you would look at probably having something in place by 2028. The fact that this is talking about 2030 suggests that there's quite a bit of process has to happen in the meantime. One of the issues being obviously there'll have to be legislation. So it's just to see if members are content that we explore the sort of full spectrum of what's required. So go for a fairly fulsome piece of information on that in terms of lead-in times, legislation times, how you would go about all that. Because I recall, Chair, that the officials did talk about the level of consultation required to do any kind of significant change to the system.
This domestic valuation?
To any of the systems, to be honest.
Yeah.
So it's just to try and get a feeling for how much of that's being built into the process.
So is the action then that we seek more information on the background work?
Where
that's
exactly that
happening?
timescale is coming from and how it all unpacks.
Will be done by LPS that's doing that work in the background?
Yes, yeah, they'll complete all of that. So I'm assuming they've got a plan as to how to do it. The fact that they're coming forward with that sort of date.
I think we are probably also, I don't know whether a new LPS chief executive has been appointed yet.
Ooh, I want to say yes, and it's another Sharon. It's another Sharon.
Okay. Well, I think that might be something for us to have a future briefing from.
Perfect.
So that might be for us to put that down. That we want to get a briefing on that when they come to us. Okay, members are content with that. Yes. Sorry.
Just a couple of points on this. So I can see in the correspondence we have a response in there from the Committee for the Economy, but in terms of the centralised budget role of the Department of Finance in this committee, I was wondering if we have any information as to how many departments met the deadline of the 4th of October and how many have provided that information to their committees so far, just in terms of that wider process as we get on top of it. And then the other point was we're referencing here signature transformation projects, which have also been bid for within the Public Sector Transformation Board. Again, just the point that I was making earlier, there's the difference in this transformation piece, and these are signature projects of the Department of Finance. So just wanted to flag that again.
Yeah.
Okay. Indeed. If you are happy enough, we will move on. The next agenda item is correspondence from the Committee of Economy. What you talked about, that's connected to the previous information gathering on the budget exercise. It's page 160. This is what you've just been mentioning as well, Diane. This is a briefing paper from the Economy Committee regarding the previously mentioned 3-year budgeting information gathering exercise. is to note, and the very efficient Economy Committee has shared it with us. Thank you to the Chair for that. So that's to note at this stage. The next is the NI Local Government Commissioner for Standards, which is item 9.4. At page 897 you'll find the annual report which has been published, which is to note. NIPSO, unless anybody wishes to come in, no. NIPSO report, the Northern Ireland Public Services Ombudsman, is the 23-24 report. That is published at page 924. So members, that's to note, and for the report to the Audit Committee, unless they may have it already, but if people are content with that. The next agenda item is correspondence regarding support for families with multiple births. This is correspondence calling for increased support for families which have multiple births to the Departments of Health, Education, Economy and Finance. So members, can I suggest we seek agreement to forward this correspondence to the Department? Yeah. 10. The next is the Examiner of Statutory Rules 24th report. That's page 952. No rules touching on our work are mentioned. So just for noting, the next is the Chairperson's Liaison Group. There's an update on the CLG and its work at the minute, which includes post-legislative scrutiny and strengthening committee scrutiny of statutory rules. So that's to note at this point. The agenda item 10 is draft forward work programme. That's page 988. So members, we've obviously touched on it a bit today. The Department is committed to providing us regular updates in the interim fiscal framework, and the committee will be informed of any developments in relation to the Irish Government and Apple tax matter, which was discussed some weeks ago. It's also worth saying we are due to have after recess our first fortnight today, which is still good. We're not back in the Senate. They haven't. We've.
Well, that's maybe going to happen, but I didn't want to commit to it just in case. But we are very, very hopeful that we will be back in the Senate on the 6th of November. But I just can't completely commit to that yet.
Right. Okay. That's good. That's
very hopeful.
Politicians know the importance of not making promises you can't keep.
Yeah. The power issue has been resolved.
The power issue has been resolved. Okay.
There may be Zoom issues. We're just checking out.
Okay. Well, we may be back there, but we are going to have a briefing, I think, from Joanne McBurney and her officials.
So Joanne McBurney, and we've also asked for Jeff McGuinness to be included in that, so he can update us on all the areas now that he covers. So the sustainability plan and so on going forward from that. We just thought it was an opportune time because it had been published to bring him back in, and he can comment more freely.
Okay. Do you want to give us an update then, Clark, on the rest of the...
Chair, it is very much as members can see in the pack. We still haven't got a confirmation from Open Government. We're hoping they'll be first or second week in December. We are now at that stage. We were actually we've completed and filled our schedule right until the end of the year. We're looking for the DWF memorandum of reply to the PAC report on broadband investment. We think we now have that for the 11th of December.
Yeah.
Building regs and associated matters, we're scheduling that forward for February 2025 because we think there'll be more information then coming out of all the Grenfell processes then.
Yeah.
I think we're probably still on target for that from what the department has said.
Just thinking about where we on the NI investment, where we can kind of double park.
Yeah.
So the NI investment, that's still to be if the NI
rescheduled.
Yeah, is it totally mad to try and do the NI investment fund and get a briefing from the department or someone who might know at the same time about the UK Infrastructure Bank or whatever it's going to be called, the National Wealth Fund? Because they're kind of doing the same thing.
Theoretically feels the same things. It may well not be, but we will pursue that and find out.
I just wonder if it's a way to do both of those things in the same.
Cover both.
If it's the same briefing.
We'll ask where it sits and whether it can be a joint briefing, because that would probably kill a lot of birds with one stone.
And on the 20th of November, we were talking about Nick's sickness and absence. Is that with Jill Min and the senior HR people, or is that?
We haven't been told.
We haven't been given officials' names yet.
So that's quite a lot of areas we're looking at.
There will be, so it's likely that it might have to be both Jill and Catherine.
Both them together because they have
and
to
potentially
split.
others as well, because it does cover a really broad spectrum that we've talked about sort of over a number of different meetings.
So I just wonder if any of the other outstanding points that people picked up around RHI reform that touch on that are within their purview. Just wondering where we can
They'll be able to cover everything that the department can give a perspective
cram
on.
things in. Okay.
And they will then they prepare for that. They know the questions we want to ask. They'll be able to prepare anything they need outside the department. They'll get that information in. So it's unlikely that there's much that they wouldn't cover in their normal purview.
Grand. Any other comments on the platform work?
So that's pretty much all that we are doing. Obviously, we have the date settled for the strategic planning. Thank you for that, Claire. I was struggling to get that one out. That will also, we will fold into that a full session then on setting scoping in terms of reference for the wider inquiry on banking and financial services landscape. The exciting development that I wanted to update committee on, and I'm kind of preempting one of the briefings we'll have on the 6th from the Consumer Council is, and members may not be aware, but I thought I would just bring it now, is there is a financial inclusion strategy going to be published by UKG, thinking on the 30th of October. It's probably part of the whole budget process. The suggestion would be, and again it's for members to discuss at the strategy session, that there's potentially an opportunity coming out of an action plan for that to work on localised actions and outcomes that are relevant to our very, very different landscape here. In terms of banking and financial services, there's a much higher degree of vulnerability, there's a much higher degree of recession of services leaving the area. So I think stakeholders, as always, are just a bit ahead on this one already. So I think there's probably a lot of work being done that the committee can utilise to fast forward this inquiry a little bit. So if members are content, we'll obviously bring that to the session, but I think a lot of the background will probably have been heard when we get the briefings on the 6th of November from Consumer Council and the FSB.
Chair, if I could just come in, with regard to the strategic planning session, have we any sort of plan or agenda for that? I just want to flag that in case people have other things on through the day, what the schedule is. I have audit committee that morning at 10 o'clock, so just if there is a schedule that we can build it in. I know everybody has other things going on for the day. Keep everybody there at the busiest
time. Our plan would be, it really doesn't run outside committee time other than getting you there early to have a bit of working lunch. The idea being that which
is Kit Kats actually again.
It probably will be that we are we're going out of the building. That's the other exciting thing. It's the idea being that it then allows people to sort of get out of the building.
That's great. I just thought it looked like
so
it was
we
flagged
will,
out as a full
no,
day.
not at all. Not absolutely not at all. It will look like it probably will run from about 12:45 through to our normal cut-off. Within that, we've built in a short briefing from the UUEPC on PFG, because we've not really had an outside perspective yet. It's just an opportunity to get that in. Yeah. And then we can look at what you might want to do in terms of evidence sessions. It's Gareth Hetherington. Members will recall we've had him up to talk about budget when we did our budget engagement exercise.
Yep, no, it's good. Fine.
Okay. So that will be a short part of that.
And that's on the 13th?
That's all on the 13th of November, Chair.
Okay, members happy enough on the forward work programme? Obviously there will be other additions and changes before and there are lots of people we need to before we so if members are agreed, we will publish that, which brings me on to, I could have mentioned it. So any other business, I have two bits of any other business, one of which is directly related to what we just discussed, which is we did publicise our banking financial services inquiry. So any member obviously is invited, encouraged to publicise that. A couple of local journalists nodded to it, and I think certainly I would encourage local small business groups, local community groups who are interested in creating more work for the Clark team.
Sure, but the more capture,
to come
the
and give us
better,
evidence.
because that otherwise it's the usual people, and trying to widen the net is a big part of how we want to move things around with this.
The second any other business for me is that to make members aware, tomorrow I'm chairing a panel, not in my capacity as chair of the Finance Committee, but in my capacity as an MLA and having set up an all-party group on press freedom. I'm chairing a panel on what are called SLAPs, Strategic Lawsuits Against Public Participation. There's a conference in Dublin by the Index of Censorship. So I'm chairing a panel, I'm not speaking on it directly, but it's on SLAPs in relation to the environmental sector. So I thought I would make members aware that I would be in a non-finance committee capacity speaking.
Chair, do you want to reflect very quickly now that it occurs to me on the Fiscal Council conference that you spoke at yesterday?
Yes, people are probably bored of me talking. I think, but I will be very brief. It was very, I think, positive, and I was very pleased to be able to give the views of the committee and some of our scrutiny thing. They were keen. It was a very technical discussion. I attempted a joke or two, and I realised after the first joke that it was not the crowd. That's me. Or my jokes were terrible, but it was a good. It was a really good event. The minister gave a really good detailed speech, and there was the chair, my counterpart from Scotland, yes. Kenneth Gibson, and others. It was very good. So. I would encourage anybody, if you have researchers who you want to get a bit more research and kind of, I don't know if it's online or people can watch it back. But
there's they put a whole lot of the segments online, video segments.
So I stayed for a couple of panels afterwards. There was, I stayed for the first panel, which was particularly interesting. There's a guy called Joachim Werner. I need to remember his name. He did very interesting to bring in my inner geek. Interesting stuff on a fiscal council and what you would look for when you're legislating to create it. And then there was someone who gave the perspective of the Welsh official who's involved in a lot of the work around Holtham and the fiscal framework. So I think basically everybody at that I would like to invite back to the committee at some point where it's relevant, because there's a Welsh official who will be able to give us evidence on how the Welsh fiscal framework and floor was agreed. And then there's someone from the Fraser of Allen Institute, which is a think tank in Scotland, who is also very interesting on how some of their tax devolution works. And then there's this chap, an LSE academic, who gave a very interesting presentation on fiscal council stuff. But we're well into the geekery now.
I was going to ask, was there many local stakeholders?
There were good, yeah. There was loads. So like the FSB was there. Pivotal were there. It was mostly locals. It was just that it was mostly locals. Obviously, like. Robert Choate, Maureen O'Reilly and Esmond Burney were there from the council. The minister spoke, Robert Choate spoke, then the minister spoke, and I didn't stay for all day, but it was a good session.
Across sectoral, like, not just the usual, or was there no?
Well, a lot of it would have been, there would have been some academics.
Yeah.
There wouldn't, like, it wasn't lots of academics and lots of interested
The most enticing thing for broader, yeah, okay. No,
yeah,
that's
I'm not saying, we're still an open session, so I can't say anything too blunt, but it was a good set. It genuinely was a good set, and in terms of our future scrutiny work, there's stuff there for us that there are people who we can get to do interesting work for us.
It's always useful to hear about new people that we can bring in, because our stakeholder net is not necessarily as wide as other committees.
Yeah, and I think that is one thing about the Fiscal Council, in fairness, is they've been able to kind of convene people to engage, and that people who weren't like 5 years ago. And I would say, in fairness to Conor Murphy for setting it up, they got Robert Choate, and they got people who are, so there are now people who are engaged who were not paying particularly much attention to fiscal policy here 5 or 6 years ago. Okay, and anybody else wants to come in, or any other business? I will adjourn. The committee is now adjourned. Date, time and place. The next meeting is Wednesday, 6th of November, potentially in the Senate chamber.
You just text them.
Well, we'll let you know.
Committee Room 21. Sound. Committee Room 21. Sound.